Kia ora tātou, nau mai, haere mai. Welcome everybody to our Committee of Council for Thursday the 26th of May 2022. Special welcome to members of the public in the gallery. I'm Mayor Grant Smith and I'll be chairing today and possibly tomorrow's deliberations. This meeting's been recorded and will be live streamed on the Council's YouTube channel. We have some health and safety housekeeping to go through. It'll be shown on the screen in a moment. And just in the unlikely event of an emergency, our exits are listed with the green signs, and you will evacuate to the assembly area near the clock tower in the square Te Marae o Hine. This building is a non-smoking facility, and again, unlikely event of an emergency around using a defibrillator, that is located at the front of house on the ground floor. Any incidents, please just report them to our committee administrators here. While we're in COVID-19 protection framework in the orange setting, please follow those protocols. Also, for our online participants, if you could keep your cameras on, please, and your microphones muted unless you're addressing the meeting. Councillors in the chamber, please use your voting device if you wish to ask a question, comment or propose an amendment. And councillors online, if you could please use the hands up function. Also for councillors online, if you want to text through any amendment, obviously to the committee administrators. And for our officers and any presenters, please give your name before speaking and using the microphone. It just helps for those online. So today we have our council in the chamber, but those online are Councillor Bowen, Councillor Johnson, Councillor Dingwell, Councillor Dennison and Councillor Mickelard. We're expecting Councillor Finlay as well. Right, we'll get to our order of business, and councillors, on page 3 of our papers, apologies. I haven't received any apologies from anybody. I would expect a full house today, but we will put an apology for lateness for Councillor Finlay. I'll look to move that, seconded by the Deputy Mayor, and I will ask for a vote on that, please. All right, that has passed, 15 votes for and none against, thank you. Number 2 on our papers is notification of additional items. We do have several. Schedule B, which is a replacement for the original schedule that was circulated, and Schedule C. Reasons for the lateness was the short time frame to gather the information in response to public submissions. And the reason that the items should be taken into our papers is they form the context and options for budget deliberations. So I'm happy to move those, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. Any comments to that? There being none, again, I will ask you to vote, please. And that again has passed, 15 votes for, none against. Thank you. Right, number 3 is declarations of interest, if any. Again, I haven't been notified of any. And there's none off the floor or online. So we'll move through to confirmation of the minutes. It's number 4. that the minutes of the Committee of Council meeting of the 10th of May 2022, Part 1, public, be confirmed as a true and correct record. I'll look to move that. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. And are there any matters arising? Online, Councillor Dennison.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just in the first session, excuse my voice, I'm going to battle today. It's got Councillor Finlay in attendance, and that was a day we had the DHB meeting. And I'm wondering whether he was in attendance or not. So it's just a question, and unfortunately he's not there just to confirm it. But I do know that he was online for the DHB meeting that morning.
We will double check and triple check that. Thank you, Councillor. Staff are just making some notes, and we'll add that.
Thank you.
Two matters arising. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. Look, just some corrections, just in terms of the listing of the chairs for the various sessions. I'm actually sort of overly subscribed as a chair, and some of the chairs actually did change through. If I can just quickly go through my notes. Session 3 was Councillor Butt. And Session 4 was Councillor Naylor. And Session 5 was Councillor Petranis.
Yes, it had you in the chair on all of them. We're overstating it.
Precisely. Thank you.
Thank you. We will make those changes. So it proves the minutes do get read. Thank you. All right. Are there any other matters arising? There being none, we will look to vote, please. That has passed 14 votes for with 1 abstention. Thank you. Right, we will now move forward to the main reason we're here, which is around the annual budget moving forward. And we invite presentations from the officers and any questions. And we'll have our Acting Chief Executive, Chris Dyerberg, our Chief Financial Officer, Cameron Mackay, and Strategy Manager of Finance, Steve Patterson, and at times joined by the Property and Infrastructure, Acting Infrastructure Manager, Bryce Hosking. Before we get to that, I just want to make some comments, some general comments before we get into things. And look, I just want to acknowledge the submitters that have participated in the consultation document. Thank you for sharing your views with Council. You can be assured they were taken on board, and everything was read, and in some cases double read. So it's clear that local government does have some issues, just not Palmerston North, but our system of rates revenue, I believe, is unsustainable going forward into the future. It's something that I discussed very briefly with the Deputy Prime Minister yesterday. He was in town giving a budget address. And I do hope that the future of local government reform does go some way to addressing some of our issues. Revaluations, legally we are required to do that, and every 3 years we have to revalue the city. And Hawke's Bay, some parts of the South Island, Taranaki, and ourselves, it's our year. And in past years, Palmerston North has been relatively static. But in the last 3 years, we've seen a huge increase. And because we are on a land-based system, which is effectively a property tax, we've seen it go through the roof. And hence, we have the dilemma we're in. The tools that we've got are pretty limited, and I think our councillors are going to address us with that. It does look on paper that many of our residents are very wealthy, but we know that the ability to pay and the reality is the relationship bears nothing to their income. So how do we fix things? We've got some adjustments that we could make around our uniformed annual charge, and there are some differentials that we can adjust. But it does beg the question, is the system unsustainable? And I believe it is. So I'll now pass to our officers, because I do think we've got quite a challenge ahead of us. But to you, Chris, thank you.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's a privilege to be sitting here to lead the officers in this discussion today. I must say it's a lot easier sitting over in that part than here, but that's what you get when you take the big job. Look, just first of all, just following on from your comments, Mr. Mayor, we completely acknowledge that this is one of the hardest annual budgets that we've collectively had to do. And primarily for the reasons that you mentioned. And I suppose I wanted to just assure everyone in the room and, everyone in Palmerston North basically that officers are 100% on board with the challenge. We are where we are, and as you've mentioned, there's not a lot of levers that we have. So look, we have looked under every bush. We have tried to get creative, and we'll discuss some of the options that we've got there. Even my finance colleague has proposed carrying forward some operational budget for some one-off items to help minimise the impact. That was something that probably 6 months ago I'd never thought I'd hear. It's one thing that we can do. So look, what I did want to assure everyone around the table is that we are on board with the challenge. We know that we're going to have a robust debate today. We're going to have to look at everything. There will be some things that are really uncomfortable to look at, but we're up for that challenge, and we're confident that we can make a difference. There is one area that officers will try and dissuade you to change, and that is the things that go to impacting our ability to attract and retain staff. That is by far our biggest challenge as an organisation, in being able to deliver on the plans and deliver to our service levels that our residents expect. It is often an area that it's sort of relatively easy to look at and say, that's a big number you want for remuneration, let's have a look at that. I get that, and I'm expecting a robust debate on that, but I'm just sort of saying that is an area where we are going to try and dissuade you strongly to go there. There's some other areas that actually have a big impact on our ability to attract and retain staff as well. As an example, the buildings that we're in, we know that they are tired in a lot of areas. Not only are there issues relating to sort of fire and earthquake issues that we need to address, and we're all aligned that they have to be done, but there are things just in relation to the quality of our buildings and the environment that we create for our staff to work in. It is really, really competitive out there, and these are things that actually go right to the heart of whether people are prepared to come and work for you. They don't want to come and work in a place where the furniture is 30 years old and as are the carpets and the paint. So look, we're not, and we don't believe that the plans are outrageous. All we're wanting to do is to create an environment that gives us that ability. Workforce transformation as well. That's another area where we're going to try and dissuade you from touching. It's a relatively small amount, and it is really, really important that we create an environment where people feel they can come into and have some development. It is hygiene factor for a modern organisation, and it's really important that we do that. The last one that I think I'd like to mention is just sort of some of the things around digital transformation and the network. it's also really important that we provide our people and staff the ability to do their job and have, good quality tools. So things relating to our computer networks, our computer technology. You're aware of a number of the issues that we have that we're trying to address. So that's another area that goes to the heart of that. Well, and I'm sure we'll cover those areas in more detail later. The last thing I wanted to cover before I hand over to Cam is just to acknowledge that you probably were a bit surprised when you looked at the capital program that is the updated capital program that came through. All the conversations we've had has been around making sure that we put up a program that is doable and that we can have confidence around. So I'm sure many of you thought you'd see a lower number than what's there. And I acknowledge that, and yes, and I'm expecting some fairly hard questions about that, and in fact I welcome them. We've done a little bit of work to preempt that conversation to try and give you some background about why we believe that program is reasonable, and my colleague Bryce will be, he'll talk to that later and happy to explain why we believe that is reasonable. That's all really I wanted to cover. Obviously, we've got lots of questions to answer through the day, and we've got our team hopefully all lined up and ready to go, and we've anticipated the things that you're going to want to ask us about. So, over to you, Cam.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, Mr. Mayor and councillors. I think just to follow on the sentiments, we acknowledge that this has been a difficult annual budget to prepare. We have acknowledged the submissions from those who are feeling a real pinch out there because of the rating revaluation and just how much variability that has caused across the city. And I think there's no real doubt about it that process has caused issues for this annual budget, and does highlight the fact that the rating systems and legislation that we're bound by does have some challenges, but nonetheless we have to follow the legislation as it is put, so that process has to take place every 3 years. I just want to cover a few points first before I get into a little bit about the annual budget update, and really it's taking just a bit of a contextual view of the economic picture as we are now, and I acknowledge that it is a rapidly evolving environment out there in the economic sense. So probably even from when we were sitting here 2 or 3 months ago, things are changing at a pace. The thing I just want to highlight, and we've made reference in the committee council papers, is the inflationary environment out there. It's changing at a rate that we probably haven't seen for a very, very long time. What we've used by way of assumption for this annual budget is Buell Local Government Cost Index. That was set in September and it's updated annually. So that adjustment that's made to our budget to reflect the changing costs is roughly around 2.4%. I think we'll all be aware that of the reported CPI increases as facing many households and goods that we come to purchase, that's now hovering up around the 7% mark, and that's been going rapidly upwards for some time. Also, to that vein, we took a little bit of a look at the construction price index. That's a scary number to consider as well. That's up at last look 11.4%. So when we consider those elements and the fact that we've allowed 2.4% because that is the sector standard for benchmarking inflation, we will have some challenges in the year ahead, I would imagine. The second point to that, The tool that the Reserve Bank uses to moderate inflation increasing, of course, is the OCR tool. So you may or may not be aware, yesterday the Reserve Bank raised the OCR by a further 50 basis points, or 0.5%, and indicated that in the year to come a further 1 to 1.5% is potentially likely. So that's something that we certainly are cognizant of, and we have made a minor adjustment to our assumption based on the latest information. We had an interest rate assumption of 3.1%. We've adjusted that to 3.4% to reflect that changing environment. But it's just to highlight that seems to be moving a lot faster than what we would have thought even 3 months ago, as the Reserve Bank tries to combat rising inflation. So I just wanted to give a bit of a context as to help you understand the challenges that we face ahead. In terms of annual budget update, so just want to cover a couple of points off in here. We acknowledge that there were a significant amount of submissions relating to rates increases, and particularly the impact of the revaluation on rates. So I just want to highlight some of the things that we will talk about today and possibly tomorrow in terms of how we are responding to that and trying to give some options in terms of how we could moderate that effect. We've considered further adjusting the rating system, which we'll get to shortly, to help acknowledge the pain, particularly in the residential part of our property sector, and we will talk about that. There are options that we can do, but like anything, because it's an adjustment to a system, what favours one group will cause a pain on another. So that is a challenge that all the way through this that we've been facing in terms of looking at our rating system. What will help some will cause an issue for others. The other thing that we've really looked at as a group is what options could we have to moderate the overall total rates increase, which has a benefit to all. Chris, the Acting Chief Executive, has highlighted one such tool that we've been considering, which is the utilisation of this year's operating surplus in part, which would normally go to offsetting debt to fund some one-off operating programs for next year rather than collecting further rates for those. We will talk about what we've considered as part of that later on, but this is probably something that even 3 months ago would have been a decision that we would have thought twice about. But actually, I think if you consider the environment we are in, the fact that this year our programs have been impacted by COVID, which is in part the reason why we have the surplus, there is good reason why we could use that as a tool, as a one-off tool, to consider the big picture that we're in now. The other area that we've looked at and provided some options and prioritisation for is our operating and capital programs. We have put up some options around what potentially could be reduced or deferred, and given a bit of a priority to them, so that that helps you in your decision making in terms of what items will have an impact and what ones may not have quite the same impact if we decide to defer. We do have officers in the room to help support and guide those that debate, to help you in informing your decisions. Just one final point that I'd like to make. I acknowledge that decisions we are making over today and tomorrow is basically around how can we give effect to some of the submissions that we've heard around alleviating the rates increase. I just want to give a little bit of a reminder around how council operations is funded, because I think that is important to acknowledge as we're going through and considering what to defer and what not to defer. So the operating program has the biggest impact on rates. That is rates funded. It is the area that will have a direct correlation to any savings in rates. The renewal program is funded on a 3-year rolling average. So why I mention that is, as you're considering that aspect of the program, if it is a program that has budgets in year 2 and 3 following, deferring the program and moving it along 1 year will have an impact. If it is a one-off renewal in the budget, deferring it 1 year won't actually impact the rates increase, because it will still stay in that 3-year rolling average by the way that we fund renewals. So it's just, I think that's an important point just to consider as we're thinking about our options. And the other thing to consider in the renewal space, we've highlighted through the long-term plan process and this year's annual budget the need for renewals, the need to ensure that we're managing the risk of our assets that we have don't fail. That is potentially the consequence of some of what we might do in terms of deferring. So we can provide context when we get to that point on specific programs. The third area that we fund as a council is, of course, Capital New. The impact when we reduce that program is not so much in the year coming, but it does have an impact subsequent, because it will have a loan and interest repayment the year after. But it's just to be mindful that in terms of what has the most impact, that is probably the flow of consideration for you. Anyway, that's the points that I would like to make. So I will happily hand back to you, Mr. Mayor, and then we'll get into the presentation.
Great, thank you. Right, well, we will get straight into it. We've got a big day, so the floor is back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Joined with me is Steve Patterson, the Finance Strategy Manager, so instrumental in helping us pull together this work program for today. We have got a proposed approach to run through, and the way in which we've ordered the schedules, I hope will be of assistance. So I think we'll run through first to give a bit of an update around the engagement summary, just to highlight some key themes that have come through that process. Then we'll move into the rating system, what options that we do have. Steve will help us navigate that complex area, and then we're moving into the operating areas. So if we can, we'll move along to the engagement summary, and we have somebody from the communications team to come and help give a bit of an overview on.
So Cameron, what we'll do, rather than waiting for questions right till the end, yes, I'll allow questions in sections. So councillors, if you've got any questions around the engagement summary, the submissions summary, comments on the submissions, we'll take those as a group. We'll then move forward to 4A, which is around the rating system, the revaluations, and we'll take questions on that, and then we'll go block by block. That is the best way to approach what is a big piece of work.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Back to you.
Right. And we have Liv with us, Communications Manager, to talk through the engagement.
Good morning. Just to quickly summarise the engagement we did for the annual budget, which I know you were all heavily involved in. I guess the first thing that went out that most of our residents probably found out about the annual budget this year was every property received a flyer in their letterbox encouraging them to learn more, find out more information and to attend our virtual sessions. We had displays at our library and customer service centre. The website was the main hub for our consultation, like always. I guess one of the interesting things to note off that is this year we, like other years, have had the search tool where people can see what their proposed rates are. That tool saw a 171% increase in the tool's use during the consultation period compared to the days previous to that. And the other thing is that people were using the tool to look at multiple properties, not just their own, and we saw trends of people looking at other properties on their street as well to see, I guess obviously to compare how that worked. We had virtual sessions that many of you attended. Due to COVID-19, we didn't have any in-person ones. We had 6 online sessions. They were focused on the, I guess, the kind of key sector areas, so sport, environment, community services, arts, business, and kind of an Ask Us Anything with all of you. We had media coverage during the consultation period, and we worked closely with some of the stakeholder groups, particularly in those areas, to encourage them to get involved. Social media, of course, was one of our tools, both on an unpaid base, so people who use our page, but also targeting other people through advertising who live in our city but don't follow our pages. And then I guess the other big thing that happened was we had the Facebook Live, which involved key officers and the Mayor, and that reached 19,000 people. I guess some of the trends from that are also the trends we saw in submissions, so things about the proposed rates increases, QV valuations, planter boxes, and at the time of that, the glass recycling was still suspended, so we did have some questions about that as well. We had radio advertising, more than 200 ads during the consultation period, newspaper advertising in both the Standard and the Guardian. We ran digital ads through Google and NZME, so that's where if you're on other websites you get reminders that our consultation's running, and we had quite a good click-through rate of people seeing that who then get taken to our consultation pages on our websites. That pretty much gives you a pretty good summary, and if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Liv. There is a few. I'll go online to Councillor Johnson.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Liv, for that summary. One of the observations that I made partaking in some of the engagement sessions online from individual phone calls to me and emails, and also through reading the submissions, was that there did seem to be maybe not a clear picture to submitters of the effect of revaluations on council income. So there certainly did seem to be an opinion that we would be receiving extra money as a result of the valuation changes. And I wonder how well you feel that we communicated the implications of the valuations as opposed to the increase, the total increase of 8.3 that was proposed. Do you think that we did enough of a job in explaining to people how the revaluation works?
I guess I'm kind of mixed on that, because I think the fact that we have the December valuations that went out, that was another, I guess, a period where we were able to remind people that that would have an impact. One of the things I would say is that within the first few days, we did see a lot of commentary, and we worked with the finance team to I guess, change up the messaging a little bit to make it much stronger and clearer about the impact, particularly on those properties who were going to face the the higher increases. I think, using numbers like 8.3, people will see that number, and of course one of the big things that we did, and you can see from the statistics, is encouraging people to actually go and check out their individual property. I think one of the things that our team in finance have talked about since this, and I guess leading up to any CV/LV consultation, is we need to do some bigger awareness about how rates work and how council services are funded and all of those kind of things. So I guess I feel pretty comfortable with what we did, but I also see opportunities ahead for what we should be doing before that. This has been a good, I guess, understanding of what people do and don't know about how we fund services and facilities.
Okay, thank you. I'll save the rest for comment, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. My question, I think, has largely been covered by the comment that was made to Councillor Johnson about how the understanding of how rates work. But I also wondered, Liv, if you had a comment on the effectiveness of the online engagement model of taking all of our discussions online. I certainly received some negative comments around that, but also some positive ones that enabled some different people to participate. So any reflections on that at this stage?
I think going virtual was the right thing to do at the time we were in with COVID. I don't think that should be the go-to solution permanently for consultations. I think we should offer both virtual and in person. And I also think one of the things I guess I've been thinking about is in the past we've always done drop-in sessions and things like that at libraries, and it's really made me think that actually I think we should be going out more to where we know people are rather than asking them to come to us. So I guess to explain that further, like things like going to playgrounds and things where we know there are big numbers of people rather than encouraging them to come to a set place where we're going to be at set times. So having more, I guess, natural kind of engagement sessions where we know there's large groups of people gathering at places where we can just have some more, I guess, informal conversations. I think having the Teams things, I guess the other thing I would say is that digital technology, of course, has become natural for all of us over the last couple of years, but a lot of people don't use things like Teams and Zooms in their day-to-day jobs and things like that. And so that could always potentially have been a barrier. We did try and have some good information about how people could access and things like that, and that's where things like Facebook Live, which most people do have pretty good access to social media and understand how that works, that provided that, I guess, kind of backup option in that scenario.
Thank you.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Liv. Question that's come to my mind more and more as we've gone through this process is kind of the disconnect in time between the revaluation information coming out late last year and then what's happened this year with the annual budget process. I'm just wondering, from a comms perspective, would you have advice for us, and there might also be a finance lens on this, about when that revaluation comes out, potentially flagging at an individual property level what the implication of that might be, so that people that are still within that window of being able to appeal their valuation have a much more tangible understanding of what it might mean in a few months' time. Is there a way from a comms point of view that we could possibly line that up, and then from a finance point of view as well?
I think from a comms perspective, obviously that would be great to do. What I would say is that the information that goes out comes from QV, not us. So that would have to be a conversation with QV about how we could get additional information put in. But from a finance perspective, I guess, Steve.
Morning, Councillor. Steve Patterson. I think the time frames for getting the valuation material out are very, very tight. And the sign-offs given by the Valuer General one day, and then there's a very short time frame for then getting the material to the printers and beyond. So, and so for us then taking that material on board into the council and linking that to our rating material so that we can do calculations is a very significant challenge to make anything that's really meaningful. But it's certainly worth a discussion, thinking for 3 years' time as to how we might go about it.
Thanks. So if I can just clarify, that sounds like it's kind of logistical barriers as opposed to anything actually stopping us. Is that a fair summary?
I would think, yes, it's certainly a logistical issue, and it's something we'd need to consider as to just how we'd go about it.
Great, thank you. My final question on this is around, again, the valuations, but how it's flowed into this conversation around the annual budget. We received some information, Liv, that was identifying that both commercial and industrial values had gone up. But as recently as this week, we've seen in the media a statement that commercial values actually went down. So is there something that we could have done more strongly around getting some of those really simple fundamentals of the valuation story much more clearly into the public realm than we seem to have managed to have done?
Councillor, I'll cover off a little bit about the valuations in a slide or two, but in terms of that statement in the media, that statement was incorrect. The commercial values did go up, they just didn't go up quite as much as the residential ones. And so the material that you have been given from us is correct in terms of the impact on those sectors.
We'll take it from there. Thank you, Ms.
Councillor Harper.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Liv. Just feedback that's been received about the card that went into the letterbox probably was a little bit misleading for some of the residents. So just wanted some comments from you on that card and whether we could have improved that card for residents to clarify. Just your feedback on that card, really.
I think is your question that they were misled over whether their valuations? Okay. I think the tricky thing is, I guess, with these kind of submissions is just for your background, when we put a flyer out, we put about 2 weeks. So we had pretty much written a lot of that ahead of the final discussions. I think looking back, we potentially could have stressed the valuation information more. However, what I would say is that you would probably, and I guess one of the things that we brought up in the virtual sessions and Facebook Live is then a lot of the submissions are just on the rate, but not actually suggestions for all of you as to what people would prefer we reduce service or increase levels of service. So I think with the only way to kind of get around that and have that would be to have, I guess, a more thorough booklet that went out, which of course has cost implications. Yeah.
Just going further onto that, have you got an estimate of how much it would have cost to put more information into the letterbox?
I'll have to refer to my marketing manager, Jess Ballinger.
Kia ora, Jessica Ballinger, Marketing Manager. The flyer of just a one page is about $5,000 to go to all of households. And that's because we ensure that it goes to all of rural, so like up to, and they classify rural as Bunnythorpe and obviously all that kind of stuff. So we ensure that we go to all those places and that's why it costs a bit more money. So it costs about $5,000 each time you add a page, but so if you're looking for, say, a double-sided, if you're looking for about a 5-page book, it's probably going to cost about $10K, which doesn't make sense in terms of maths, but they start to scale the pages down in price and different weights of paper and things like that. So we can probably do it for about $10K. Apologies, that's not very clear.
Oh, thank you for giving us that information.
A comparison, I think, with the Nature Calls booklet that went out in the March 2020 consultation period was, I think that was $18,000. That was, of course, I think about 20 or 30 pages because of...
Yeah, they start to scale the pages, which is brilliant, but it makes it a bit hard to give you an estimate of just like this. Apologies.
Okay, well, thanks for giving us that comparison. Thank you, Liv. Thank you.
Just on that, and before I go to Councillor Hancock, I know where Councillor Harper was going with that question was around, and I know it fell differently right around the city, but we'd spoken a lot about the draft general rate increase of 8.3 being signalled, but in reality, for some, it was much, much higher. And a lot of the feedback you certainly got initially on social media was, where's the 8.3 coming from? But it was really 8.3 plus revaluations for some residents.
Yeah, so within the first, I think on the second or third day of the consultation period, we rewrote all of the newspaper and radio ads and updated the social ads to play down the 8.3 and really encourage people to go and check their own personal properties, and really stressed the types of properties that would have seen those bigger increases.
Yeah, and that started to come through a little bit later on. But certainly by the time I'd got the thing in the mail, I'm going, I can see where the comments were coming from, because at the time it probably was the right thing to do. But certainly from days on, people started to realise that, heck, we're 20%, or we're possibly even more. Some were less, but we were hearing from a lot that were more. Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. And I think we've just kind of started to touch on sort of, my question is really, can I just get a better understanding of the timeline in terms of the original consultation document, when we actually then introduced the online tool where people could actually calculate their rates, and its relationship to the submissions that we received from the public? Because it would seem to me that once that facility was made available to the public, we then subsequently got quite a bit of, heat in the submissions.
The search tool, all information goes out on the day the consultation period starts, so the property search tool was available on the first day. Typically with any consultations, we see a big burst of submissions in the first week and then the last 2 days of the consultation period.
Great, thanks so much, Mr Mayor. Chair.
All right, that's exhausted the questions, so we can move on, Cameron.
I'll just wait for the slides to come back up. Thank you, Hannah. Okay, so the next section that we're going to talk through is again covering off a little bit of the revaluation and the options that we have in terms of the rating system to moderate those effects. I just want to stress again a little bit about what I mentioned earlier, that when we do go adjusting the rating system, that the bucket of money in that adjustment stays the same. It's just that it then some that will get a benefit will mean that someone else will get a adverse impact. So we will discuss a little bit about that as we move through what we have done, and we have done quite a number of models. But the challenge that we also have to consider when we've done this and brought this back for your consideration is we don't have the ability to go back out and reconsult. So what we've had to do is ensure that we land at a result that is in listening with the submissions that we have received, but also considering at what point might we think someone would consider that we need to be out consulting again. So Steve Patterson will talk you through the work that we've done in this space. I'll pass you over to Steve.
Good morning again, councillors. I thought it would be useful first to have a quick briefing, if you like, about the valuation process, since you've had quite a few questions about that, and there's not a clear understanding about that in the community at times. The valuation is done, of course, it's the council's responsibility to do the valuation, and we have a contractor that does that work for us. That contractor must undertake that work according to a series of, according to some legislation that prescribes how those are done, and some rules that are set by the Valuer General that have been in place for many years and have stood the test of many revaluations right through New Zealand. In terms of what they value on our behalf, they value the land first, and then they value the total capital value of the property. So we get those two different values issued, and we make that available at the time that it's signed off by the Valuer General. In this particular revaluation cycle, I pushed hard to make sure that our revaluations were done at the time that they were done. There was quite a bit of work being done nationally to reprogram when valuations were being done because there was such a shortage of valuers throughout the country, and the Auckland Council's valuation was being done at the same time. We're very, very lucky here in Palmerston North in that we have a very solid, experienced professional team at QV who are recognised as some of the best rating valuers in New Zealand. And so the Valuer General's Office recognises that in the way that they evaluate the outcomes that they produce and the material that they can rely on from what they do. So from my perspective, the valuation was conducted very professionally in a time frame that matched the expectations that I had in managing that contract with them. The outcomes weren't unexpected given what people were paying for property, and of course the valuation reflects the market. As you'll be aware, of course, the land has become very scarce, and for that reason people are paying what seem like astronomical sums for blocks of land, particularly those that are capable of holding more than, well, several rating units, several residential units, whether they be by way of subdivision or by some other type means of having additional units on the property. So there are lots of examples that the valuers gave me of situations where they were able to see exactly how the market was operating in those areas, and of course the values that they attributed then to properties throughout the city reflected what was happening. And where in the past perhaps values had been high in some particular parts of the city, the market was actually moving to pay higher prices right through the city in traditionally perhaps lower areas of value. So there was a lot less, if you like, of a difference throughout the city in terms of what was being paid for land. So that reflected in the valuations. And another key part about the rules that handle the way in which the valuation is undertaken for land is that they're valued as if they're vacant on their highest and best use. So that's the standard, that's the legislation, that's the valuation rules. And so it makes no difference in that land valuation, if you like, if there is already a house on the site and it's located in the middle of the section, for example, and it would be difficult, say, to subdivide. That doesn't influence the way in which the land's valued. That does, though, perhaps reflect in the capital value that's attributed to it, because someone buying the property with the intention of creating more units on it would take into account where a current building was located on it, and that might mean that they valued the improvements very lowly on the property relative to the land value. So, as I mentioned earlier, we must undertake a revaluation every 3 years, and it's sensible to do so, I'd have to say, because in that time frames the city changes. Where properties are and which is desirable and what's not, that it continues to evolve, so it's sensible to reset the base. We would like perhaps for that to be not quite as dramatic as a 3-year movement as we had this time. And once upon a time, in order to try to overcome that, there was an attempt to look at annual revaluations, and Wellington City tried this at one point, but it became unmanageable. And so all councils, so that trial wasn't successful, and councils have reverted to the 3-yearly cycle, and that is the same as what we've always had. The valuations are done at a single point in time, so it's trying to say what was the market actually saying as at the 1st of September last year, and the key reason for that is that so that there's I suppose, equity right across the city, and that you've got that point in time. It then makes not really much difference if the values move up or down subsequent to that, because the whole city's been valued at that one point, and that's just becomes an allocation base. So I've heard some comments from some who've been concerned that the values have gone down now, perhaps. In fact, the way I understand it, in most cases, the values rose quite significantly after the revaluation through till December, and those that have retrenched since then have perhaps retrenched to more like what the rateable values were being assessed in September. There might be the odd exception to that, but as things stand at the moment, those values are reasonably reflective of what's happening at the minute. So in terms of the process, it's a very, very tough period to get that revaluation completed in the timeframes. That was achieved, the process worked well, the audit was conducted in a very, well, they met the timeframes that were required. I'd put a lot of pressure on the Valuer General to make sure that we got these figures when we did. It's important to me and to us that we had them when we did, so that we could have some time then to evaluate and to come back to you, as we did in December, to outline what the potential impacts might be. Some councils, like Auckland for example, where the valuation was delayed, really struggled then to try to come to grips with the revaluation, because the Valuer General said that the valuation wasn't up to standard, needed to have further work done on it, and so it got delayed, and that put them in under real pressure to try to work out how to handle what the impacts would be going into their rating for the next year. The Valuer General was complimentary of the process and of the standard and the outcomes, and so I have great confidence in that, and say to you that we're exceptionally lucky in this area that we've got the standard of professionalism applied to this process. From the council's point of view, though, I understand that that then the challenge for us is, well, how do we use those numbers in terms of the rating system? And that's put pressure on us to try to interpret that and to think what we might be able to do differently if we feel that the outcomes in terms of the total rate that's then being charged is unreasonable. And in some respects, the rate, I think, that we're ending up perhaps proposing for some properties is not totally unreasonable. It's just that the level of change from one year to the next is significant. And so that is something that's really hard to overcome. There's not a way in the system of being able to do that. It sort of reflects, to an extent, you could say, that some people haven't been paying enough over the previous 2 years because the values have been progressively changing, and then here's the catch-up point. It's harsh, I know, but that's sort of the way it is. We've got this reset every 3 years. So I think from my perspective then, I just wanted to reinforce as strongly as I could that it was a professionally done revaluation, it was up to standard, the process was sound, and I would say that there's no way that we could legitimately stand up and say that it was one that had any faults in the process itself. So I'm keen just for you to understand that. So I guess that's just that particular issue, Mr.
Yeah, before we go,
Questions?
and I'll just see if there's any questions. I've certainly got a couple. And I appreciate, Steve, you've been away and you probably haven't heard the 8 sessions of hearings and the challenges to the system,
I know that.
the understanding of the process, the algorithms, which have not been shared publicly, and the New Zealand Valuer General. I'll be, if I get permission from Council, I'll be writing to him as a council, challenging the process, asking for the public release of how do they value 2 properties right next to each other with the same value of land and very similar houses, and they have very different ongoing rating valuations. It just doesn't make sense, and there's multiple examples have been given to us in this chamber. Nobody can explain it, including the very people that you've, and I understand you're valuing you are protecting the professional reputation of the organisation, but was there any, could I ask the question, was there any advice given to them either by the government or by somebody else that they must value intensification?
The valuation rules have not changed for many years, and so they've applied this time exactly the same process as what they've done in the past. And as I said, in terms of the rules, they require them to value them they're reflective of the market, and they're required to value them in a way that assesses the land as if it's vacant and on its highest and best use. And I think in terms of the...
so that is actually influencing intensification.
Pardon?
That is influencing intensification.
It's taking account of what the market is doing, because the council has available to people the ability to be able to have more intensively use land than what was once possible. So that is an important ingredient, obviously, in terms of what people would be prepared to pay for land. And so these values reflect that. And in terms of the comment that some people's land valued side by side might be different, well, we've not seen the examples, or exact examples of where that is the case, so that we can, if there are exact examples...
There's 340 submissions.
No, but Mr Mayor, I challenge that. There are that many submissions, but in terms of them having mistakes, if you like, or inconsistencies in the land value, that's not the case. The people who have objected, perhaps to their land value, 80% of them are wanting their land value increased and rather than reduced. And I appreciate that not many people actually are that much interested in their land value in truth at the time that they see it. They think, that's great, I've got an increased value on the books. But and there's no black box or whatever of stuff. The valuers' records are part of what we have access to, and if there's specific examples of people where we believe that there's a mistake or something being made, then we have the ability right now to be able to have those drawn to our attention, and we can go to and talk with our valuing team and understand what that problem is. So there's nothing that needs the involvement of the Valuer General to do that. We have those links, we can do that right now. If there's a particular example that you, for example, have of that you'd like to share, we can take that up and have a look and see what the explanation is. And if we then felt that there was a mistake that had been made, and there is sometimes a mistake made, then there is a process where that can be handled and that can be fixed. Okay,
well that's good to know, because I'm not sure that has been well signalled to our residents and the public. And I understand majority of it is a desktop study,
yes.
And there is some form of algorithm in the background which
yes.
mixes it all up like a recipe or baking a cake, and what comes out is what comes out.
And what they do, Mr Mayor, is that they try to, they've got the city sectionalised, if you like, into different areas with the different use types, and they can apply algorithms to those when they understand what's happening in the particular part of the city. They can then apply in a mass way to their tool, and then they go through and they have all sorts of ways of testing the outcome to see that it's robust. And then, of course, there's the objection process or the testing process beyond that, and the process beyond that. Still, where if there is something that comes to our attention that looks obviously wrong, there is a mechanism where we can have that attended to.
Thank you. Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think you got a little bit to my question as well around, Steve, to understand when it says that valuation rules say that land has to be valued as vacant. I can understand the word vacant. I do have a little bit more trouble understanding highest and best because it seems potentially subjective. So can you just help us understand what highest and best means?
I'm not a valuer, so I can't give their interpretation of it, but they would interpret that to be talking about, well, the particular value with if there's a use of that land that means that it's going to be bought by someone to use it in a particular way that will get more from it than using it in some other way, that would be what the way they value it. You're right, there is an element of professional assessment about that, and that's why the valuers we have those valuation techniques at their disposal to use their professionalism to come to that conclusion.
So to clarify then, best means best financial, not necessarily best community or other?
It's highest and best use in terms of, yeah, you're right, in terms of financial.
Thank you. My second and final question is just around, you alluded to the Wellington City Council example where they sought to get into an annual cycle. Could we, while maintaining a 3-yearly cycle, phase in effects over time? And is that option available to us today?
No, you can't phase in effects. The legislation talks about having a district valuation role, and the role can be only a role that's approved by the Valuer General at any particular point in time, and it would be the whole role of the city that became a new role at the time that it was approved by the Valuer General. So either the sort of examples in Wellington, it's more than 10 years ago now, where coastal property values were changing really significantly, and there were some centres where that became problematic, and they tried techniques to see if they could make it work, and it just wasn't practical to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Steve. I just quickly want to, I guess, get an answer to this. Did we rely solely on the QV and the QV audit and the Valuer General's decision around the application of the revaluation to the city? And the second part of that is, did we actually do any work to stress test or validate that in terms of how that might affect various postcodes across the city?
Part of what we do in engaging the valuers that we have is to test whether there's any particular need to do a peer review. And sometimes, once or twice in the past, we've had a peer review for a particular property, usually a commercial property if it's a one-off sort of situation. But in this situation, we had people who were well experienced, they knew the market, they were tested through the various ways that the Valuer General tests us, and that's his role. And there isn't any point in trying to bring anybody else into the loop because they're not experts in rating valuation, because the rating valuation is a different valuation from other types of valuation that are done. So I have every confidence in the work that was done. As I said, and as Amir mentioned, it is in the main a desktop process for some things, but there are lots of properties that are visited, and all of the material that goes from the council in terms of it doesn't affect the land value so much, but all the material that we have in terms of plans for buildings and development and the like, they're all part of what they have at their disposal to understand when the capital value is assigned to a property, what's there.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. The answer is obviously no. Thanks.
Councillor Johnson online.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I've got a couple of questions. The first one is, Steve, it was said by a number of submitters that the valuation was, that a motivation in the valuation was that council was wanting to pressure people to subdivide. Are you able to comment on that?
That, I understand, probably arose from a comment that we'd made or I'd made that some of the greatest impact in terms of increase was in those areas which were capable of subdivision. And I was corrected a little bit later to say that it's not necessarily just subdivision, but where there can be additional units on a property without subdivision. It's certainly the council's planning objective, as I understand it, to enable people to further intensively use the land that's in the city, and so that's a planning goal. And the rating system, as one of its objectives, is to try to work, I suppose, in a way that's not inconsistent with that. But we haven't overtly at all, as the council, looked to use the rating system as a tool to force development. It's certainly not been in anything in terms of the material that we've had, or it wouldn't have influenced the valuers, except to the extent that the market is taking the opportunity to purchase land and to develop it in a more intensive way than what used to be the case, because the rules enable people to do that now.
Okay, thank you for explaining that, because I think that did need to be stated. The other question I have is, in some of the material you've supplied, you've also given us examples of what the rates would be if we were using a capital value basis for rating. Can you comment on what differences it would have made if we had a capital value system for this revaluation round?
To be honest, I have not modelled the outcomes from the revaluation to see what changes there would have been if a rate had been set on a capital value basis for the current year and then one set on a capital value basis for the new year. I have not modelled that to see what would be the case, but it is the case from my recollection that the capital values actually changed by slightly more than what the land values did in total between the commercial and the residential sectors. And so from that point of view, in terms of the impact between the sectors, there might not have been a significant difference in terms of the amount of transfer from the commercial to the residential sector. But within the residential sector itself, there was obvious, in some cases, and I don't have the table in front of me that shows this, but there were, the capital value moved as well, but perhaps not quite to the same extent as the land value did. Although in some areas the land value movement, of course, pushed the capital value up as well, and meant that the so-called improvements, which is the difference between the two, became very low in some cases. But I guess that's part of what we're going to test in the future is whether that would have made a difference, because it would substantiate a move, if you like, towards a capital value if it would have moderated it. And I can't say for sure that it would have. It just would have meant at the moment that there would be different people that got an increase than what was the case this time.
Right. Are you able to describe those different people that would have got an increase?
Well, in terms of those that get the biggest increase at the moment, obviously it's those slightly bigger sections that are capable of holding more units, some of which were valued quite lowly in the past, and their value now is quite high proportionately. Some of those properties have improvements that are not too significant. They're a single house that's might be an older house, and so those types of properties would likely have received a rate in the end that's lower than what they would under a capital value system because of the impact of their improvements not being nearly as significant as others.
Thank you.
Before I go to Councillor Butt, Councillor Johnson's questions were quite quite good in the sense that, Steve, many of the submitters proposed different options to the valuations, like a cap, delaying it, using capital, which in some quarters is deemed a fairer way of spreading increased costs. But we're legally bound, aren't we, to use the new valuations under the Act?
Yes, once the Valuer General has implemented the new district valuation role, which was the case back late last year, then that becomes the role, and we've got no choice about that then, even if we wanted to have a choice.
And our only tools we've really got, and we're going to tease that out in a moment, are around how we set that rate, or to use a phrase or a term, how we equalise it over the sectors.
It's entirely in the council's hands then as to how we set the rates, and obviously the system that we use is an embedded system driven by what we've got in our revenue and financing policy, what we've got in the 10-year plan, and to an extent, some elements of it, what we've got in the annual, in the funding impact statements in the annual budget. And so what we've looked to do ever since December, in terms of the work that we've been doing, is to try to highlight to you what the implications would be, what the tools are in terms of the differentials or the uniform charges and the like, to try to moderate if you felt moderation was the right thing to do, and obviously that's the test we have to have for ourselves as well. Should the market just be left to its devices, or is there good cause to intervene in some way to moderate? And our suggestion to you was that we did moderate it in some way because fundamentally the land value was becoming more consistent throughout the city than what it had been before, and once upon a time there were great sectors of the city where the values were exceptionally high and others where they were low, and so from that perspective we recommended 3 years ago that the UAGC come down a bit, and that reflected that. On this occasion we've been tossing, modelled all sorts of options, tried to find ways, and at the moment, the tool.
And you've given us some options too around that UAG, that uniformed annual charge, where we can.
In the past we did, yes.
Yeah, and we've still got some to have a look at today. And to hear you right, differentials, we can moderate or spread that better across the different sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, rural residential, and even rural.
Yes, we can. We've got the ability to do that, and at the moment we do that by the way in which we describe our differential system. And if there's a really fundamental change to that, that would be something that would need to be consulted on as part of it.
We understand that. Yeah.
So yes, we do have those tools, and we just got to be. Yeah. We've got some ability to move from where we've gone out publicly, but not huge change.
Yeah, no, understand that. And it's also worth noting, because a lot of submitters, and rightly so, felt that the council was getting a lot of extra money. But it's actually the same money, because we haven't heard from a lot of the residents whose rates went down. No. Is that right?
Well, true, and we were at pains all through the process of the last few months to reinforce that point, that the revaluation does not generate any additional money for the council. We've said that over and over and over, but people haven't heard that.
Okay. All right, Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Steve, for your explanation. I understand, as you said, that the rules have not been changed. The valuation rules have not been changed from the previous time. But you just said that in previous times, some of the properties were not, the values of some of the properties were not increased with the same ratio as they have done this time. What's the reason? I couldn't understand that.
Well, the values reflect what the market's paying. So people are out there buying land, or were at the time in September, buying land furiously to develop. And that is why and 3 years previously they weren't doing that. And 3 years before that they weren't doing that. But I think the 3 years before that they were doing, the land values increased quite significantly at that time. So it's just a reflection of what's happened in the market.
Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Steve. Steve, just to clarify, we're discussing a lot of around the ones that have got the increase, but there's a significant amount of ratepayers that have had a decrease. So we cannot use a targeted rate, or there's no tool to smooth those ones that have got a decrease, because you seem to have the ones in the middle that have got the 8.3, then you've got the sections that have now got a minus rate, and then you've got the ones up that have got the 15 to 20 plus. So there's no tool in the kit that we can use to smooth that out.
Well, of course, we have traditionally used the Uniform Annual General Charge as a mechanism to try to have less being related to the value, if you like, as a way of smoothing things. And the lower that UAGC gets, the more we become reliant on the value. So the value movements at very low levels of UAGC mean that if there is a valuation movement, that will be more pronounced. In our case as well, I guess in terms of the overall rates, for as long as we've got the two of the waters that we charge as part of the rates as a fixed charge, we are also, by doing that, moderating the effect of the revaluation, because if we'd been charging for water and wastewater through the valuations, there would have been even more pronounced change. So, although as the draft budget stand, one of those charges, I think it was the water one, went up quite a bit, and so did the recycling one. So those things are also impacting upon the incidents, and until we get the results of today, and if we have to go to tomorrow, we will not be able to remodel what the actual effect's going to be on individuals until we see the level of those fixed charges as well, because that will influence things in terms of what the final picture is for people. So
just to clarify, Steve, even if after our negotiations in the next couple of days, if we did reduce the rates to, say we brought the rates down another 2%.
Yes.
All we're going to be doing is moving that top end down. Perhaps if they're sitting at 15%, they'll come down to 13%, but you're still going to move the bottom people down even further. So what, so
yeah,
my question...
potentially, yes.
So-
And the only tool that would stop that would be to actually increase the uniform charge a bit more, perhaps, although it's a strange mechanism.
So increasing the uniform charges could smooth it out a bit?
Well, it doesn't necessarily follow, but and you have to sort of run them through and have a look at what the outcome is, but because there's some sort of unusual things happen in terms of the way in which the uniform charge actually, the lower it is, the more that gets charged to the commercial sector as well, because there are fewer of them. And so I guess you're right that there are some where there would be a decrease, but in reality, those are ones that had very high rates in the past compared to the average.
Yes, I can see that when you start looking at it.
They're not ones that are lowly rated that are going to go down. It's ones that might be very highly rated, and you'd say, well, they might say that their rates are so jolly high that they should. It's about time they came down a fraction. You could say. Because now what's the case is that the other parts of the city are catching up with them in a sense, because that's what the market is saying. People are not valuing location or not putting a premium on that location anymore, and so those people are not necessarily needing to pay way more than what others are paying, like had been the case of past. It's smoothing it more.
Thank you, you've answered.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I think others have teased out what things that we have the ability to change and what things we don't have the ability to change. But just one further question along those lines. You mentioned that we're obligated to set rates based on our revenue and finance policy in the LTP. To change that policy, I understand that would require consultation. What would be, if council was to feel that it needed to change that policy, how soon could that be done?
Not in sufficient time to adopt this budget.
No, clearly.
But in terms of what we're looking to do next, that policy is the next thing that you're looking to do is you've asked us to come back, you've made some policy decisions about, in principle, changes to the rating system. And so we're needing to consider the next moves in that, and to understand the impacts on rates of the removal of the water and the wastewater activities and the charges for those, and to remove the stormwater costs from the current rate, because all of those things will influence how we view what rates are going forward. So I'm expecting that our analysis going forward, we will eliminate the waters and from that discussion, and then start talking about, well, what do we think is a fair allocation of the rates, and what system do we need to do that, and how might we structure it? And there's a lot of work to do that.
So specifically in terms of the timeframes that we're within our power to progress change, I understand the rates review is coming back to us in August. What would be, if we were to decide that we would like to change that, the current rate system, what would the soonest time frame be for us to implement that change?
At the moment, the presumption is that any change would be through the start from 1 July 24. But it depends on what steps are taken between now and then. I would think there's a lot of community consultation needs to happen to understand. We've seen this and how difficult it is to get the community to understand what's happened even in an environment like this. So if we're looking to change a lot of fundamental stuff which involves extracting the three waters and talking about changes to the system, means we've got to have a lot of dialogue with the community, and I would think that anything earlier than a start that is targeted towards 1 July 24 is unrealistic, to be honest.
So just to tease that out a little bit further, because I think this is quite important for us to understand and if in fact we don't get to an outcome that our community is very happy with after the end of tomorrow, why are you suggesting the 1st of July 2024 rather than the 1st of July 2023? Could we not consult as a part of an annual budget consultation process to change our revenue and finance policy?
Yeah, well, we could, but perhaps, but it's a matter of what pre-consultation we did in most councils all councils that I know of that have had fundamental changes to their systems have gone through long periods of communication that would be far longer than what it's possible for you to have, given what I know is the political program in an election that happens in the meantime. And so just what's realistically possible for you to do and for us to achieve and for you to embrace in a way that could go out for the following year, I just don't personally think that that's a realistic expectation.
But is it possible?
Well, I don't know yet. It would we haven't got our plan sufficiently far advanced. We've been concentrating on getting this stuff done for you so that we can then...
Okay.
Yeah, maybe if I can speak to that. What we're intending to bring back in August is basically to start the conversation on our plan to progress that piece of work. That piece of work is extensive. It's not a simple change. It will require engagement and quite a bit of analysis and understanding. I guess to answer your question, I feel you would have insufficient time to do that piece of work for 1 July 2023 and do it well, because this is an area that potentially we could be challenged going through this change, and certainly other councils have gone through this change, have had challenges along the way, and I think we need to do it justice by giving it time. And also the other consideration is just how much of an effect in terms of the long-term plan does that have, and whether that would require a redo basically of the long-term plan alongside such a fundamental policy change. That would be a significant piece of work, and my advice to you really would be 1st of July 2024 would be when we'd be looking to implement such a change if that was what was desired.
Thank you. Just finally, just to tease that out one last little bit, so the reason that you're saying 1st of July 2024 is not because there's any legislative thing that stops us from doing it in 1st of July 2023, but rather the workload that is required to do the consultation adequately. Is that correct?
Yes, correct, because you can amend a long-term plan when you desire, but again, it comes down to ensuring that it's done in a way that that is fit for the type of change that's been requested. And this is significant. A change in rating system is a significant change.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Councillor Johnson online.
Thanks, Mr Mayor, for allowing us another lot of question. It's just one question about the uniform annual general charge, following on from Councillor Beatty's questions. My understanding from the graphs that we were supplied with in March is that there's what might be described as a pivot point in the land valuations, below which reducing the uniform annual general charge reduces the rates for a property, and above which reducing the uniform annual general charge increases the rates on a property. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes.
Certainly in terms of the way we showed that graph, yes, there was a point where they seemed to intersect more or less. I don't remember honestly what that point was where it was intersecting in that particular thing, but it was influenced to a degree as well by the other charges that are charged for those other services, and just quite what that might be. So that we will need to have a look at that, obviously, and out of today and tomorrow, if once you've made some calls about things, we will need to model the outcomes so that we know what the real effect is of whatever's provisionally approved today in terms of the material that's used as the focus for preparing the material that comes to you on the 15th of June. So, because we've done lots of modelling, but we don't necessarily know yet until you make the calls about what programs are in and out as to just how that will fall.
Right, so what you're saying is, and from memory, the pivot point was about a land value of about 750,000. Again, looking at the graphs that you supplied there, about 3/4 of the property values for residential were below 750,000. So what you're saying is, at the moment, you can't be sure exactly where that pivot point lies because it's influenced by other decisions.
Yes.
But is it, how sensitive is it to change?
I don't have that in my head as to quite how sensitive that is. I have modelled some example. We've given some examples in the report, which we'll come to later, of what the effect would be at various levels, and I've also last night looked at if the UAGC was further lowered, what the effect on those particular ones are, and I can give that information when we come to it in the report as well, just to show what that is.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Steve. I've got two questions. One is around, I guess, because we've had a significant increase in land value in a lot of our low-income areas, what would be the ramifications if a significant amount of ratepayers weren't actually able to pay their rates? And has that happened in other, I guess, cities who have areas, councils that have gone through such a significant land value change?
Obviously, it's concerning. We want to be able to set rates that people can afford. There are, we have our staff who work with people to try and help them budget for paying rates, but if they really and truly can't afford it, it is certainly a problem, and rates are a charge that ultimately ends up being a charge on the land. We just have to work with those people to see what can be done in terms of helping them to budget for what needs to be paid.
But if there was a significant amount of people who simply could not pay quite an increase in rates, would that have I guess a detrimental effect on our, I don't know, deficits and things like that? Like, how has that kind of thing happened in councils before, where you've had a huge amount of people that have said, look, we just can't pay it?
Well, people in various places have struggled to pay, and sometimes there are schemes where rates have been postponed or the like, if there's severe financial hardship, for example. But rates are a tax that's ultimately payable one way or another. It attaches to the land, and so you don't write off rates. So we have to work through with people as to how that might be accomplished.
Okay. And my second question was, given that we've had 43 submissions asking us to, I guess, investigate, looking at capital value instead of land value, would those submissions go through into, what you're looking at as part of consultation? Like, does consultation start now?
Well, it hasn't started now particularly, but certainly we'll take those into account as some information that can help us understand what people are experiencing.
Right. Okay, thank you.
All right, councillors, we've probably exhausted that. Just before we will break now, I think there's probably a natural time because we're going to go into what the proposals are in the draft annual budget, but also some other options for us around the revaluations. But Steve, just to clarify, you did make a comment around if there was an obvious misvaluation, residents did have an opportunity to talk to officers around that. Was that, did I hear you correctly in that?
If they believe that there's a mistake in terms of the way in which the value has been prepared, they can talk to us about that, and we can follow that up and understand what they're saying.
Right. I don't want to open the Pandora's box.
No, I know
but,
that.
yeah, yeah, no, I mean, that came across in some strongly to us in some in some submissions around the actual valuations and the miscalculations in the eyes of the submitter. So, okay, that's good. All right, we'll break and we'll be back at, we'll just say 11 o'clock. For the public, there's a cup of tea outside in the link span, and councillors online back at 11 o'clock, please. Thank you. Kia ora tātou, welcome back everybody. Right, we will continue along with the revaluations presentation, and back to you, Cameron, and we'll get the presentation back up on screen, and this is around the rating proposal that is in the draft annual budget, and if we can perhaps go through that at some pace, and then some, and what those proposal options are. And there's a number of slides there which have been pre-circulated to councillors, thank you. So we can sort of take those as being read, but if you want to perhaps summarise and highlight those points and different options. So back to you, Cameron and Steve, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yes, we'll take that schedule largely as read. Basically, we have modelled various scenarios. The one that is in the attachment is around a change to the differentials from 180% to 200% to try and moderate the effect on residential properties. And we've tried to highlight the effects that has both on the residential sector but also on the non-residential sector. And we've also since modelled what the effect would be of reducing the UAGC further to $200, and we also looked at what it would be at $400 as well, just as a check for ourselves. As I highlighted earlier, by altering the differential, it's not necessarily meaning we're collecting more or less rates as a total. It means that who's paying for it gets altered. So when you do these alterations, what that means is that in the differential case, there is a benefit to the residential sector, and there is a increased cost to the commercial sector. What we've tried to do is we've tried to put that at a level that brings the change between the sectors as a result of the valuation back closer to what it was pre the valuation in terms of the size of the buckets each pays. But it's just a reminder to you that because of the way the valuation has settled, in both sectors there are pockets paying significantly more and some that are paying significantly less in both sectors. So when we do, if we do approve to make that adjustment to the differential, there is a small number of people in the commercial sector that will get a larger increase that was already reasonably large. Noting that as a whole, there is quite a number in that sector that we're getting reductions in rates. So this is where some of the challenges that we've highlighted earlier in the day arise. We don't have a tool necessarily, one stop shop to moderate that aspect of the valuation. Is there anything further you want to add to that, Steve?
I'm just wondering whether we're going through these, but what's taken as read?
We're taking the report as read, so the schedules.
These ones?
This one.
Oh, yeah. I think, councillors, if we go to this graph here is a slight extension of the one that's in the appendix, and it includes an additional column of light blue which shows what would happen in terms of the number of properties that would be impacted into the levels they'd be impacted in general terms if the UAGC was even lower at 200. And you'd see in the residential sector that means, so compared to, well, go back a step. But the two options, the silver one and the light blue one, both assume that the total rates take for the council would be 6% as opposed to the 8.3% that's currently. So with that in mind, and they assume that the surcharge that we express as being 180 or 200 would be 200 in relative terms. So both of them assume that, as does the orange column. So the orange column is what the number of ratepayers that will be impacted at the 8.3% rates increase, whereas the next two are at a 6% increase. So you'll see then that the things that impact on the increases that apply to individual ratepayers are the total rates take, as you'd expect, this changing the differentials, which you'd expect, the uniform charge that you'd expect, and in the end, the one element that I can't show you right yet, which is to do with the fixed charges for the things like the water, wastewater, and the rubbish and recycling, which will be influenced by decisions that you've yet to make. So those assumptions about the level of impact here assume that those are at the level that we've consulted on. So it could be that there's some reductions in those yet to come.
Sorry, Steve, before you move on, so the legend along the bottom there, because it doesn't have anything.
No, it's not quite as full as it could be to describe.
Yeah, so that is saying, a negative, there's none a negative 25% rate decreases, and then it's negative 25 to negative 11, and when we get those sort of high points, that's where the rate increase would be 6 to 10%.
Yep.
11 to 15%, 16 to 25, and so on. Is that right?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. All right.
So if we were looking at the column of 16 to 25, for example, increase, that's saying that the proposal we went to the public with, there was about 7,000 properties in that category of people that would get an increase of that sort of magnitude. And that if we move the differential for commercial, it reduces that number by about 2,000 down to the...
And that's on the assumption that the differential's from 180 to 200, is that right?
Correct, that's correct.
And we're working off a base of a 6% increase.
So at the orange one, no, is just talking about solely at 8.3 and the 200% increase. When you go to the next one, the silver coloured one, that's saying what the same things as before, except that the total rates take would be at a 6% level as opposed to an 8.3% level, and then the one below it, the next one, the light blue one, is all of those things except a uniform charge of 200 as opposed to 300. So,
and Steve, is there a level? And I mean, I think there were some questions from Councillor Johnson earlier about that uniformed annual charge. There is a bit of a limit, isn't there? To if we went to 100, it doesn't necessarily mean to say it all goes down, or does it?
Well, the effects of reducing the UAGC are two or threefold. First, more of the rates ends up being charged on the capital, on the land value. And so it depends then whether you're measuring the level of the increase that there's been for people. So those that have got a very large increase in their value have more of it that's subject to the higher proportion of the rate being charged on the value. And so I guess there are two things that we're conscious of in terms of the rates in the end. One is the rate that's being charged in the end for the property a reasonable rate without thinking about the level of the increase? The second is, what's the magnitude of the increase from the current rates? Ultimately, the system of valuations and whatever, the rating system is designed to be trying to say, well, what's the appropriate level of rates? And if it's a fair rate, then maybe we've just got to recognise that sometimes there's going to be a significant change from one year to the next in order to achieve that fair rate. So that's the challenge, reaching, well, what's a fair system, and we're studying that some more in the future. But for the now, what we've been trying to decide for ourselves and recommending to you is just where that balance point is and whether we should go any further than the 300 to perhaps 200 or not. And as Cam mentioned a little bit earlier, if you reduce the increase for some, then others are going to have an increase. And in broad terms, the increase would end up being in the commercial sector, where if we're looking at percentages there, the light blue column does show that the commercial ones, there's more of them that get a bigger increase. And so that's the trade-off really in the end, is just quite what we decide is appropriate.
Steve, you've asked us a couple of other questions here around making changes to differentials for multi-unit residential properties and rural,
yes,
rural residential. So how do you treat those?
At the moment, in the proposal that we had that went out publicly, we reduced the differential for multi-unit by a little bit. There was a 5% change to each of the different of those, and I'm at the moment not suggesting that we make any further change to them. It's as we went out publicly. And in the rural and semi-serviced areas, there we changed in terms of what you adopted back in the draft, some changes that basically reduced the level of discount, if you like, that those rural properties get. Reduced that marginally in each of the different three categories that we've got for those. So some people say to me that we perhaps underrate at the moment some of those properties that are in the sort of lifestyle type blocks. Many of those, though, well, to qualify to be in that group, those properties don't have access to the water and the wastewater systems, and so their total rates will be lower anyway because they're not charged the charges for those, and they have to provide those services for themselves. But it is something that we've drawn attention to going forward for the review, is that there's not a clear line as to how we should be treating them. There is a case for them being increased some more at some point, but we're not proposing that right now. We have incorporated in the draft some changes that do increase their effectively their rate a little bit, but in their case too, it sort of depends a little bit on the value as to whether by reducing the UAGC, whether that means they end up getting a lower rate still than what they would have. It's something you have to look at one by one just to understand the impact there.
Okay, and you've got here too some minor further changes to differential surcharges may be appropriate. Is that what you're just talking about now?
That was in the original, yes, and that slide that we had back there. True, that was sort of saying the particular, that was the intro, basically saying that some further changes might be possible, and really then that slide that we had back as our, if we go back to this one.
One more?
Yeah, that one there. Oh no, yeah, that one. What we're saying is that we've got really the movement to 200% was what we're suggesting as the option, really. You could go further, and we've tested that, but my feeling is that takes too much of the rates back. The balance goes too far there compared with what we've gone out and publicly consulted about. But at the 200 level, it's still, I think, not sufficiently different from what we consulted on to mean that someone would be, I guess that it passes the test that someone would have already submitted to us on the level of change that they had based on what we consulted on, and that a further change up to 200 wouldn't be the thing that would inspire them to want to have to consult again. Well, for them to make a submission, I'd suggest.
Right.
We haven't tipped that balance there by moving to that.
No, we understand. So also, before I go to councillors online and in the queue, did you do a survey of other councils that have also gone through this process, and what are they doing?
Yes.
Briefly.
Well, I did seek feedback from councils around the country on an online tool that we have to see what feedback I had. We painted the picture and said, how have people addressed it? And I got very little feedback, as it turns out, but the ones who I did get feedback from were opinions that I value, and they were ones that suggested that the approach that we've taken were really the only tools that we've got at our disposal, and that we've done, if we've exhausted those, then we've basically done what's possible really to end up having a result that is within the bounds of the legislation and the like.
I could probably provide just a brief comment on that as well. In a previous life at a different council where I came from, we had a very challenging rating revaluation ourselves the year before last, and there is no silver bullet to be able to adjust quite a wide variation in valuation outside of the two tools that have been mentioned. We at that time as well were looking how we could moderate, and it's really through UAGC and differentials.
Okay, I'll go to Councillor Naylor first.
Perhaps, but I might. Sorry, Mr. Mayor. In terms of the things that in terms of the presentation, one of the things I didn't have that would show the impact too of what would happen if you moved to a $200 UAGC as opposed to that. I got this stuff in the slides here to do with the overall picture, but in terms of one of the other appendices, we had an appendix where in the rates material which showed some examples of properties that had large increases, small reductions, etc. That's on page 132 of the agenda. And I thought it might be useful just to understand what would happen to those examples if you had a $200 UAGC, because that then makes sure you have the full picture if you're addressing that thought a bit later in the meeting. You'll see that, but perhaps I can run down some examples and just tell you what those figures are so you can take a note of them for yourselves if you want to. The first one there, we've said scenario 2 would be 3870. Well, with it must be right at the pinch point in terms of valuations and to a degree, because it would only change by $1 if we had a $200 UAGC, that one, 3869. By comparison, the next one, with a $200 UAGC, it would in fact be higher. It would be 5799. So, and the following one, which we say the scenario with the 200%.
Sorry, which page are you on? Just
132.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
So that third example there, which at the moment says 5138, in fact, with a $200 UAGC, it would be 5183. The following one, which we say would be 4821, it would be 4855 with a $200 UAGC. The next one is one that's slightly different. It is slightly reduced by $5, 3766 with a $200 UAGC. The next one is one which currently says would be 9,099 under the scenario. It would go up to 9,289 under the 200 UAGC. The following one, 4,088, would go to 4,095. The one that says 6,119 would go to 6,195. 5,435 would go up to 5,491. So you'll see there in those residential examples where there are, whilst your thought might have been that the $200 UAGC would reduce them, because if you looked at the graph and saw all of the number of properties that were getting an increase was reducing with a $200 charge. There are some examples, like these ones here that I've mentioned, where there were some of the bigger increases, that in fact, apart from one, those ones all got a further increase by reducing the UAGC. And if you then look at the decreases, the properties in the next section that had examples with decreases that were over 1,000, well, the level of the decrease would be reduced and their rates would be higher than what's proposed under that current scenario. So that 9,257, for example, would become 9,453. And the 9,852 would become 10,069. 5,336 would become 5,388. And so for the average one that we had in the next line, where I said it would be 3,031, it would become 2,999, just under 3,000.
So I think what we're highlighting there is that there is a pivot point, and I think it was around that 3,800 odd mark of rates that properties are paying. Properties that are paying higher than that will, through a lower UAGC, will pay more, and those that are below it will get a benefit. So it's just to highlight that it doesn't matter whether you're in residential or in the commercial sector, there is a pivot point by changing that. It's not a one size will fit.
And I think I do need to, in terms of giving you the picture, just go to a few more of those examples on the next ones, which are the commercial ones. There we've got that section with examples with rates increases that are over 2,500. And the first one of those is 8,092 at the moment in terms of what's shown there. It would go to 8,252. And the $99,600 one would go to 103,166. The 22,435 would go to 23,135. 27,284 would go to 28,067. The 33,676 would go to 34,790. And the 198,516 would go to 204,488. So I guess just to round out the picture with the other three examples that we've got on that table, where there are decreases that would happen to those commercial ones at the moment, that the level of the decrease would be less, and that the rates, instead of being 73,511, would be 76,061. Instead of being 61,938, there would be 64,046. And that larger one there, that 567,737, will become 586,846. So you can see that the ups and downs in terms of the impact of these things, and it's a judgment call as to what's the most appropriate sort of thing to do. Recognising that all these examples I've given you here in this last lot of table all assume that the total rates increase would be 6% as opposed to 8.3%. That the commercial differential would be increased to that 200% and either $300 or $200 UAGC.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I'll go back to Councillor Naylor.
Thanks, Steve. All of this modelling and those examples you've just explained is very helpful. A couple of questions. Just firstly, based on what you've just described about the impact of the if we went to a $200 UAGC, perhaps the negative impact on those higher value properties. Do you think that could be an argument for us to consider putting the UAGC back up from 300 to 400? Or would that negatively impact on the lower value properties?
I guess a general comment there would be that it would have when you adjust the UAGC, there's going to be some properties that benefit and some that pay more. And I think you'll find that a result would be we found that pivot point of that property around that 3,800 mark. That's probably not going to move either which way by $100 change in UAGC, but those that are below it, if you go up from 300 to 400, will pay slightly more. Yep. And then those that are higher will get won't pay quite as much as the $300 example.
Okay, thank you. So the picture that you had on there, which the graph that's on page 131, the middle one. So obviously there's winners and losers in this, and the levers that you've proposed here in terms of changing the differentials, I guess the losers are the commercial sector, and that's shown quite clearly on that graph, on those graphs on page 131. So I guess that the comparison to dropping the rates to 6% does soften the blow a little bit, but doesn't get it back to the starting point of the dark blue graphs. In terms of specifically, I'm looking at the 16 to 25% increases and the 26, particularly the 26 to 50% increases in the non-residential graph, that even at the grey graph, even at the 6% rates increase is still quite a bit higher than what the dark blue, the current existing graph is. So my question is, what would the rates increase need to drop to get that back down? Would that be 3 or 4% to get it back down to that dark blue line?
Don't know the answer.
That would be difficult to provide an answer without actually modelling it.
So would we expect the difference between the orange and the grey being the difference between 8.3 and 6, would we expect if we reduced by, say, a further 2%, that would be a similar reduction in the number of non-residential properties that were up in that upper bracket?
Again, I think we would have to model the effect, because it comes down to ultimately as well where the reductions in budget would be, given that some items, as Steve's alluded to, are a fixed charge component. So there would need to be modelling to tell you what that answer is. Yep. We couldn't give you one just based off a linear sort of equation. It might not necessarily be a linear type change.
Just final question is, Steve, you made the comment on sort of the threshold where we might have expected residents to submit had they known that the changes that we, are making. Specifically the non-residential sector and the impact to those, particularly in that, say, for example, 26 to 50%. So, there's an additional maybe 90 or 100 residential, commercial or non-residential ratepayers who will be in that upper bracket that wouldn't have been in that upper bracket based on the draft. Do you expect that they may have submitted if they were aware that we could change their rates increase to actually be a higher rates increase?
Who knows entirely? I mean, I'm not sure. To my knowledge, we haven't got any submissions from commercial property. Not that I'm aware of. I don't think we've got any submissions from commercial people at the moment, despite the fact that there are some that would face reasonably significant increases. I don't think that the increase that's proposed here would have influenced them any more so than what would have been the case through what they would have been provided with previously.
So the submission from Amanda Lindsley from Chamber of Commerce, would that
yes,
represent that
I guess
sector?
it would.
Because she was asking for a zero increase.
I'm sorry, yes, I've forgotten Amanda's one. That's easy to say in general terms, but broadly in the central city, I would think that land values have not increased, but there are parcels where the land value in the commercial sector has increased, and so a broad statement like that can be taken at face value, I guess.
Okay, I think that's answered it. Thank you.
Online, Councillor Johnson, you've been waiting patiently. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thanks, Stephen Cameron. A couple of questions. One is around the judgment about how far we can make changes to what we've consulted on without triggering a reconsultation or triggering a challenge to the rates. So given the weight of submissions requesting us to reduce the increase in rates for the residential sector, how far can we go? Is it just a matter of opinion? So you've given us the advice that you think we can go as far as 200% on the differential and potentially lower the UAGC to 200, but because they're the only levers that we have. But if we wanted to go further than that, is your advice that that would be risky?
You're right, it is a judgment call, and we may or may not get challenged depending on if we took it further. Who knows? I guess it depends how widely people understand and come to know about the level of change. But my advice, just on reflecting on it a lot over recent weeks, is to be a wee bit circumspect about the level of change that we decide that's appropriate. We all recognise and appreciate that there's been a big level of concern from the residential people, and there's no, I mean, that's not surprising about the level of change. A little bit about that is born about not really understanding how the revaluation is a 3-yearly reset of the base, really. So I've tried to say to myself, well, in the end, are the rates that are going to be charged for the land and for the services a reasonable rate? And do we just have to work through the fact that some of these increases are quite high for some people? And in the end, I think that's what I've concluded, that we really, the only option we have is to try and make the call as to whether we think the rates in the end are reasonable or not. And the council, in terms of what it's going to look at later in the day, is responding to the public mood, I suppose, about what we should be spending money on in these times, and perhaps reducing the overall requirement a little bit in response to that. But in terms of the allocation amongst ratepayers of the rate, it is all a judgment call, and my considered advice really is that probably 200 would be about the balance of where we go in terms of the commercial change. And I'm not sure, I have to say, about the level of the UAGC. I previously recommended to you the 300 at the draft stage. Having looked at the 200, there are obviously, it reduces the number of ratepayers who would face a significant change, but whether in the end that means that the rates that are being charged to those people are fairer or not, I'm not sure. It does moderate the level of change for some. The consequence as well, though, as you've sort of repeating myself a little bit, is that there's some that are going to have an increase that they wouldn't otherwise have. And I guess it's a political call in the end. I don't really have a firm advice one way or the other.
If perhaps I could just give one final comment to that, and that is that the more change that you propose to put through at this point, the more that you pull the different levers, the more chance there is that that there is a risk that maybe someone might question that. I think where we've landed with what we've put forward in the paper was to try and find and it is a judgment, to find a balance that we felt gave effect to the submissions that by weight of it came from the residential sector, but also recognising that there are some in the commercial sector that also are getting quite a change as well. Not all of those in the commercial sector are getting decreases.
No. And my other question is around the proportion of residential properties that would get a reduction if the UAGC were to be lowered further. And my read of the data that you gave us in the March meeting is that approximately 3/4 of the residential land valuations are below the pivot point. Is that a fair assessment?
Honestly, Councillor, I don't have that in my head as to whether it's 3/4 or some lesser figure. No doubt you've looked at that and would know that. I haven't got that information in front of me.
Well, I've looked at it, but I did just want to double check that my assessment was correct, because you've given us lots of examples of individual properties that will get a rise with a reduction of UAGC, and I just wanted to be sure that my understanding that the majority of residential properties that would get a reduction with the reduction of UAGC was actually correct.
Well, the graph shows that, yes, because the graph that we've had up here earlier, if we can, it did show that there would be a reduced number of ratepayers in those categories of 11 to 15, 16 to 25, etc. So, yeah, overall, there would be a greater number of them getting a reduction than an increase.
Okay, thank you for confirming that. Thanks, Mr Mayor.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and thanks, Steve. I suppose my question really builds on where Councillor Johnson was just at. In the sample that you took us through in page 132 then, it would seem that sample primarily reflects people that are, or properties that are attracting an unfavourable result, but that there's actually, on balance, many more that would see a favourable result out of a change to 200. Is that?
I think the reason for having those examples in the report originally was to try to highlight some of those at the fringes and where the biggest lots of impact were. And so I'd heard comments from people out there and councillors as well that there are some people getting increases of over $1,000. So we tried to look at what type of properties were in that group and to give some representative examples of those.
So representative, but only within a very narrow band relative to representative across the whole picture of what we're looking at.
And that's why the graph is then showing the whole picture of what the levels of increase are. But these ones are those ones that are representative of those that are over $1,000 increase.
Okay, great, thank you.
In that case, and the representative of those particular types of groups.
Thank you. The other question that I had was just in the non-residential graphs that you've put to us in the presentation today. It kind of looks like there's almost two groups in there, and especially when you look at the kind of dollar increase. But I think you can even see it a bit in the percentage increase. There's kind of there's like a lot at the lower end and a lot at the higher end of the distribution, whereas in the residential there's kind of only a central distribution there. I just wondered if we kind of got two different groups within the non-residential that are getting lumped in there, and is it fair to kind of treat those two groups as one?
Well, the council's differential system does treat all commercial and industrial property as one group. Years ago, many years ago, we used to have more than a couple of different groups. We had the Central City group and a group that was outside of that. And in the end, the commercial sector felt that was unfair, so we made it all just one group. And so over recent times, in several revaluations, the land value in the central city has either reduced or not gone up as much as the land value elsewhere, whereas the land value in other parts of the city for commercial properties has risen for various reasons. And so it's more likely that the ones with the biggest increases in the non-residential sector are outside of the central city area.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Dingwell, online.
Sorry, my question's been answered. Thank you.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. Just to follow up with Councillor Naylor, I think we had a submission from Brian Green as well from the commercial sector. So, yep, we did have other sectors putting submissions in as well. Thank you.
Okay. We have exhausted those questions, and I think we've probably come to the end of those graphs around the revaluations.
Yes, that's the end of the section that we were wanting to present to you about the rate system per se, and
right.
now we're about to move on to stuff to do with other aspects of the...
I wonder if I do wonder if we decide on that next and then go to the operating side and everything else, because it becomes quite mixed up then. So, look, councillors, we'll give you a bit of a rest. So, councillors, what I do recommend is that we have recommendations for council to receive, that we have to receive the engagement summary, which is really attachment 1. Then the summary of submissions, which is attachment 2. And then the officer comments to, or a summary of those submissions, which is attachment 3. Now that's relatively straightforward, and I'm quite happy to move that. Seconded by the Deputy Mayor. I'll open it up for any comments. I'll perhaps start with just again acknowledging those that have submitted, and I just heard the other day where some submitters had felt that we perhaps hadn't heard the message. I reinforced that we had, and it has been a very, very bitter pill to swallow. I myself are in the same category in that quite a big increase, and I know some councillors around the table are in the 20s, and I think one of you is in the 30% increase. So we're ratepayers as well, and we're feeling that heat ourselves personally. But we've seen what we've been lumbered with really, and I just want to signal that I'm going to move a motion that we will write to the New Zealand Valuer General, Mr. Neil Sullivan, and express our concern. I think it's a very, very blunt tool on how we raise revenue for local government. But anyway, that's another issue. So we have the recommendations there. I'll open it up for further comments. The Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to make a brief comment since we are receiving, I guess, the summary of submissions to acknowledge those that did submit. We did see quite a range of new voices coming through submissions. Often we can sort of pick out our regulars that engage with council year after year, and those are always useful. It's always useful to have that ongoing feedback, but there were a number of people who we know submitted for the first time, and I guess I particularly want to acknowledge people who shared their personal circumstances through submissions in actually quite a public forum. I know that that isn't always easy for people to do, and yeah, I would just echo your comments that we certainly heard people, but I do want to acknowledge those that did share some quite personal circumstances that actually are quite confronting for people who are having to make decisions around what we deem is affordable. So yeah, just to acknowledge those.
Councillor Harpiter.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. I just, again, want to acknowledge the 340 submissions that we did receive, and thank the people that did put a submission in. But I am disappointed, and I think as a council, I think we let our community down with our process. I do think that putting out a little card in a letterbox is not good enough. I think we should have actually we did it for 3 Waters, we should have put more information in our letterbox. We should have put a booklet in our letterbox. And I think, and I know, we don't think we should be putting paper in a letterbox, but I think our community deserved more information. We shouldn't just be relying on social media. We should be giving our community more information, and I don't think we did it. And if it was going to cost $5,000 or $10,000, we should be giving our community more. Not everybody's connected to social media, and I don't think we did a good job. I think we did a very poor job. We should give ourselves a D or an E in terms of communication. I just think we should be doing a lot better. So I'm sorry to say that, but that's my personal opinion.
Councillor Johnson, online.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. Yes, I just wanted to make a couple of comments about submissions. The first one is just to echo others' comments that submissions are very, very helpful for councillors. And in fact, they're also helpful to the process. So when you get a weight of submissions like this, the majority of which are of one mind about the changes that should be made, it does provide council with evidence for making changes to the draft, which if we as individual councillors just thought that we should probably do that, but we hadn't had a weight of submissions, it would have been very hard to justify. So I don't know if submitters realise that actually having a weight of submissions like that is extremely helpful to us to justify any changes that we might want to make at this stage. So I just want to make that clear that those submissions have been extremely helpful. Secondly, I do want to acknowledge the depth to which some submitters went in their submissions in terms of analysis of the rates. As we all know, the rating system is complex. Changes to it are complex. I mean, we've spent nearly 3 hours this morning discussing it, and I'm sure we have barely scratched the surface. So the fact is that individual members of the public went to the papers, went to the rate search, did their own looking at it, and came up with what I thought actually was some excellent analysis in some cases. So I just think that that's been very helpful, and I know it would have taken a lot of time for those submitters to do that, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. So thank you for that.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Firstly, to echo the comment of others, to thank the many people in the community that have done a great depth of work to work out what's really going on here and bring us some very clear analysis and examples through the submissions process. My primary comment is that I feel we allowed ourselves to get out of step really last year in that we didn't actually see and link up the revaluation process more closely with the potential rates impact and communicate that clearly to individual residents at that time. I certainly didn't see it at that time, so I'm reflecting on this in terms of things that I need to be thinking about in future as well. But by not doing that, and I understand that there are logistic reasons why that may be challenging, we have caused many people in our community a huge amount of stress. Like the levels of stress that I have heard coming through conversations have been unreal compared to any other process I've been in at this council. And I just reflect on that. with some concern to think that actually, you know, there could have been another path that would have actually helped us get to a better starting point that wouldn't have caused that level of stress and strain in the community, as we've clearly seen come through this process. So I hope in future we can fix at least that bit of the process. The other thing that I wanted to reflect on is the absolute incredible value of open data. Making it so that individuals can actually search and find that data clearly was absolutely a catalyst to actually getting us to where we are today and understanding some of the challenges that are faced in the community. I think central government's got quite a bit on in terms of open data initiatives, and I'd like us to, you know, especially in this space, see what we can do to make that information as accessible and widely available to individuals in our community as possible. Having it on an address-by-address search basis is a start, but I think we could actually do some better things that would actually help people visualize and understand the impacts of some of the decisions that are being considered around this table. So a plug for open data, a plug for a better process, and a huge thank you to the community.
Councillor Bowen, online.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with the comments already made. The two areas I really wanted to pick up on, well, one has certainly been covered very well already, that my personal reflection on how people shared their personal information about the affordability impacts of this budget was confronting, actually, and challenging in a way I don't think I've experienced around this council table before. And I want to be really clear that that was valuable and very much appreciated. And to, yes, thank you to the people who provided some very personal stories into the public space. And then my second reflection, I think, is for us as a council, and probably builds on some of the comments just made by Councillor Barrett. I feel that we'd misjudged this conversation, that we went out thinking this was an ordinary annual budget conversation, and we wanted to talk about our programmes of work and how those might be funded, and to engage in discussion around how people might prioritise that. And that wasn't the conversation our community wanted to have with us. They wanted to know, and we did a bad job in telling them, how the rates system works, how this had happened to them, what levers council had to use, what the legal framework was that we're operating in. What came through strongly to me in the submissions was a real lack of understanding of that, and that was our fault. We hadn't explained it well, and or even at all in some cases. We hadn't taken our community with us. We'd assumed a level of understanding, and as I said, my view is we misjudged that conversation, and that put us on a back foot all the way through this process. As a result, we've been scrambling to make up and to have the conversation that our community wants us to have. So I'm encouraged that that's where we're at today, but the process hasn't been a good one. Thank you.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And yes, I too would like to acknowledge the submitters, and I agree with most of what's been said. I think one of the things that we need to consider, that the revaluations, this has been so extreme. When you look back at a piece of land that was purchased 10 years ago at $100,000 that could sell for $500,000 within 10 years. And I think we need to consider that within this, and our process has caught us out, because when those land valuations went out, if we were able to have a look at the revaluations and see the impact of rates, we could have caught earlier the issues that we've had with the revaluations and the extremes from rates going down to rates going up significantly. And we could have had some tools earlier. If we had known that impact in December, January, we could have gone out and perhaps looked at something like a targeted rate. Going out in April, March, April is too late after we've got a problem with the valuations that really didn't come through till the consultation process in March, and it's too late. So I think the key thing out of this whole thing is that when we look at the revaluations in 3 years' time again, and we could have the same set of problems, whether it be capital or land, is that when you've got revaluations which go up, down, we had the same problem with Kelvin Grove a few years back with different valuations. We've really got to understand what pockets of the city it's going to affect and what tools that we can apply at an earlier. So I would really like to advocate for us to get the rates indications on the revaluations. And that would really, you know, instead of people looking at a piece of paper saying, oh, that's amazing, my values have, you know, have now got a $500,000 increase, but they don't understand on that day that they've also got a $1,000 increase in their rates. And it's too late in March, so I'd just like to reiterate that.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I also just want to acknowledge the submissions that were made, the very honest submissions, and in particular want to make comment to the 295 people who made submissions specifically around the rates increase, and the 17 pages in of summarised comments that those people made in relation to the rates increase. And I'm certainly hopeful that we can go at least some way towards responding to those concerns over the next couple of days. Just in terms of the comments that are being made about the information that we've been provided to our community, that is our responsibility as council. And I know that we discussed it, because I know that I proposed to make some changes, and we did make, and that was supported. We made some changes to the front page of our submission document, elevating the issue of the revaluation and how that impacts on rates. I specifically remember saying people are going to be quite shocked when they realise what they are going to be paying, and that certainly has been the case. So I don't agree with perhaps the comments that others have made that they weren't expecting or we didn't communicate that well enough. I think it was very clear that there was going to have a huge impact. We were shown the graphs by officers back in March. It was explained to us well by officers. I think we understood it. I do agree with the comments that have been made about the one-pager that was in the letterbox. However, I don't think that was something that as elected members we had sight of, and perhaps that's the learnings for another day, that perhaps that piece of communication does need some additional attention. But the information that was provided was obviously clear enough for 340 people and for 295 of those people to understand the impact that the revaluations was having on the rates and the rates increase was having on their rates, for them to communicate. And I really appreciate the very clear message that has been communicated to us through those submissions.
Councillor Finlay, you had your hand up before. Are you fine? Okay, cool. Look, in summary, just in the right of reply, this has been the most difficult annual plan in my 9 years around this table. I just want to acknowledge the staff that have worked on the process. It's been really difficult. And yes, we've heard some of the messages about perhaps what things could have been done better. But look, we've got a really blunt tool of this process of how we gain revenue from rates. And I believe that does need addressing at a national level. So I hope you will support us in a moment when we want to write to the Valuer General and the government about how this process is playing out in Middle New Zealand. As some of the councillors have said, yes, the data, open data, totally agree with Councillor Barrett. There just seemed to be some closed shop there about the algorithms and how they are valuing and basically rating people. We have no say or seem to have no overview of that, so I believe that should be more open. As Councillor Johnson and others said, the depth and breadth of the submissions has been excellent. Some of the submitters have gone to some length to show the disparity in what is happening out there in the community. So I will push back on some comments that it's fair and reasonable. I don't believe it is. certainly in some cases. And you can see, I think those in the gallery and those online can sense that we don't have a lot of tools in the toolbox to change things, but we'll be trying in the next short while. And look, I think in hindsight's a great thing, but we should have all seen this coming a little bit more. Some targeted rates, as Councillor Beattie suggested, maybe some other options that were in the consultation document may have given us a few more little tools to play with. But look, we're all in this together, so we should have all seen that coming. But look, it is what it is. Again, thank you to everybody that has submitted, and we're going to go through the deliberations in the very short near future. So I'll ask you to vote, please. We'll get that up online. Just remind those online to vote, please.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, are we voting on hands or through the chat?
We've got you now through the chat, please.
Okay.
That is unanimous, 16 for, none against. Thank you. Right, I just want to explain the order of the rest of the meeting. Firstly, we're going to consider options to address the rating scheme, Schedule A. Then we'll look at how surplus could be used to reduce the impact on overall rates, Schedule B. Then we'll go through the capital expenditure program changes. Sorry. These have been swapped around. We'll go back to... We'll then look at how the surplus will be used to Schedule B to reduce the impact on overall rates. After that, we'll consider the changes to the operational schedule on expenditure on Schedule C. That will then take any changes to capital carry-forwards and capital expenditure, which is Schedules D, E, F and G. And then lastly, we'll take any recommendations in direct response to submissions that have not already been covered. And we will take each of those as separate motions and, if necessary, just move a substantive to cover that off. Look, we'll go to the first one, which is around the rating, and we'll note the advice in Attachment 4, and that's Schedule A, and it's around the committee recommends the council note Attachment 4, Schedule A, rating incidents and proposed changes to the rating scheme, and I'll open it to motions from the floor. There are a couple, and there's three, and I'll get those up if I can, please. We'll do them all together. They're all separate movers, aren't they? Yeah. Okay, we'll do this one first, just because we've got separate movers and seconders for the others. So, look, I'm very happy to move those. If I could have a seconder, being the Deputy Mayor. We've probably gone through comments, but I'll open the floor if you wish to comment on this any further. Councillor Johnson.
Apologies, Mr. Mayor, I was in the queue to comment on the amendment that I proposed. I've popped out again now.
Thank you. Councillor Naylor.
Apologies, I was also going to comment on the amendment, but what is it we're commenting on?
So we're just taking the advice. We're just noting the advice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right. I'm not going to comment. I think this is relatively academic, so I'll ask you to vote, please. And that is passed unanimously, 16 votes for, none against. Thank you. Right, we will get the other motions from the floor. And this is around that council increases the rating differential for commercial and industrial property from 180 to 200%. I've moved that and seconded by the Deputy Mayor. We've seen the advice given to us, councillors, and this goes some way to addressing some of that equalisation. We've heard about the correcting some of the misrepresentation about valuations across the commercial and industrial property sector, which have actually increased, although not as much as some of the residential areas. So I feel comfortable in addressing that, and as I said earlier, it's one of the few tools we have. So I'd like you to support that, please. I'll open it up for any other comments, and Councillor Johnson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm very happy to support this amendment. I think given the levers that have been outlined to us, we've basically got three options for assisting people with reducing their rates at the moment. One is to help the residential sector, which is what this amendment does. Another one is to help those who are in lower value properties and therefore, as a proxy, less able to pay. And that's what a change to the UAGC does. And then we've got options that help everybody by reducing the general rate rise. So to just address this one, this is primarily going to help the residential sector. The effect of the valuations was to transfer a burden of around about $10 million that had been paid by the commercial sector onto the residential sector. And by increasing the differential, what we effectively do is reduce that 10 million down to 8 million. There's still a significant transfer of rates burden from commercial onto residential, but it's less than it would have been. And you'll note that in the questions, I did inquire quite carefully whether we could push this any further, and certainly gave a lot of consideration as to whether or not we might increase it to 210. But the flip side is that the commercial sector also deserve a fair crack of the whip, and their property values have not increased as much as residential, and they have also been under significant pressure throughout COVID. And therefore, it's not reasonable to give them less of a discount than they would have, significantly less of a discount than they could otherwise have expected. We also have to factor in the risks to the ratings decisions that we make being challenged. And whilst the officers have advised that given the weight of submissions from the residential sector, that we can make a further change from 180 to 200, I accept the advice that pushing it further than that would be risky in terms of having the decision challenged. And also, I think fundamentally would push us into perhaps being unfair to the commercial sector who could have made submissions if we had advertised that we would be pushing it further than that. So on balance, I think this is probably as far as we can take this lever this time. And because it gives relief primarily to the residential sector, and because the residential sector are the ones that have had the burden of rates increase significantly as a result of revaluations, then I feel that this is an appropriate measure for us to take, and I do hope you'll support it. Thanks.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I also will be supporting this recommendation. However, I have I have had some reservations about it, and I just want to make a few comments. The distribution of the increase of rates fell much more heavily on residential. 9.6 million was added to residential in our draft. However, 400,000 or 0.4 of a million was taken off the non-residential. So I guess what we've been told is that about 2 million will be transferred over to the non-residential. Now that will have a negative impact on commercial and non-residential rates. And I just want to comment on that. That's demonstrated quite clearly on that last graph on the bottom of page 131, where there are actually more than 200 non-residential ratepayers who will fall into that over $1,000 more increase. So at the moment, that's at under 400 non-residential, that's going to go up to 600. And the reason I just want to highlight that is that unless we address the percentage increase in rates, we're having to make this decision now before we make any changes to our percentage of rates. So I'm having to make this decision. I'm supporting this in the hope that we get the percentage increase down. If we didn't, I would be very concerned of the impact of this decision on commercial ratepayers, and I think we would have some commercial ratepayers very unhappy with this. The difference between that orange bar and the grey bar demonstrates on that far right-hand column demonstrates how reducing the rates increase will soften that blow. So I'm being a little bit optimistic. I mean, I'm looking at that thinking we would probably need to have a rates increase of perhaps around 4% to get back to where we are in the draft for those non-residential ratepayers. That's where that's where I'd like to see us head. But in the meantime, I will be supporting this recommendation because I do think the benefit to the residential is significant enough and that impacts enough people in a significant enough way to take the risk on those in that other sector.
Okay, just in summary, look, thank you for your comments. Oh, sorry, Councillor. Beatty, you've slipped in at the 11th hour.
I'm sorry. I can't support this. This is going to put 600 commercial businesses where they haven't presented to us before. And if I really thought this was going to help those 300 people that have got the 15%, I would certainly vote for it, but it's not. We're talking about an 8% rate increase, and what councillors don't seem to realise is that we've got a significant number of people that are not going to get an increase at all. They're going to get a minus, they're paying less. I've got a sheet here, they're going to pay less rates. Somebody here is going to pay $600 less a year. So if we could redistribute that, so those people are paying the 8% they should have got in the first place, and the people up the other end reduce that to 8%, I'd be happy. I am not prepared to go and start putting businesses who have not been consulted about this. I look at that sheet that, I forgot his name. Steve, thank you. Get excited and forget names. That Steve gave us. And I mean, some of those businesses, there's one there that I saw at a Cowtree. They've got a $50,000 increase in rates, and this will give them another 5% increase, another $5,000. So I'm certainly, as I said, if I could help those people up the other end, I would vote for it, but this is not the way by charging some more, impacting more on commercial. So I'm not going to support it.
Thank you, councillors. I'm just going to change my comments after that last one. Look, this is about spreading and equalisation. Just to perhaps push back on some of the comments. The Country property is an $11 million property. So I think we've got to put things in context. Have people had the opportunity to submit? Absolutely. We're moving this 20% in terms of a 180 to 200% differential. This motion still, plays within the integrity of the rating and consultation system. I don't think it, and we've been given advice that it does, and that's been tested. So, look, I appreciate that there may be some slight hesitancy, but do remember that commercial industrial land has increased as well. And look, in broad terms, this will give the residential sector about a 2 to 3% reduction. It's small in the bigger scheme of things, but it is a start. So, as Councillor Naylor said, we've got some other things to discuss as we go on, but please, I'd like you to consider supporting this. It is a start. I appreciate that we are spreading it to other parts of our community, but I think we've all got to share the burden. So please vote for it. We'll vote, please. That is passed, 14 votes for and 2 against. All right, we'll now move through to our second recommendation, and this is from Councillor Johnson and seconded by Councillor Hancock, and that is around the committee recommend that the uniform annual general charge is reduced from $300 to $200. So, Councillor Johnson, I'll go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You'll have noticed during questions that we tried to explore the consequence of doing this. And I think it would be fair to say that reducing the UAGC impacts the most people in the residential sector for a reduction in rates. There are, as the office has pointed out, some fringe cases where people will get an increase. But having looked at the graphs and the data, if the pivot point is around about 750,000 in terms of value of land, 3/4 of the residential ratepayers are under 750,000 and would therefore benefit from a reduction in UAGC. Now, as I said in my opening comments, there are a number of different levers that we've got. There are only 2 that affect the rating system itself. We've used one of them already. This is the other one. And when I look at the valuation percentage increases across the city, what strikes me is they have not been even. So when you look at suburbs like Longburn, Linton, Bunnythorpe, Highbury, Awapuni, Westbrook, Tarkaro and Roslin, they have all had an average land value increase of over 100%. Now, when you compare that to the more affluent suburbs in Hokifitu, in Akauteri, they have had an average increase of more like about 65 to 70%. And the consequence of that is a redistribution of rates burden from one part of the city to the other. Now, in the submissions, we heard a lot from people living in the parts of town that I've just mentioned, who, generally speaking, have got relatively large sections that haven't had a lot of infill, and generally speaking, have got older houses. And those people are being subjected to a land valuation that in Highbury, for example, the average land valuation increase is 120%. And so by reducing the uniform annual general charge, as I tried to make clear through the questions, the people that we're helping are those with lower property values in general. 3/4 of the residential properties that have got values of less than approximately 750,000. So when we're considering how we're going to rate people, you know, it's got to be affordable and it's got to be reasonable. And because the valuations have generated really huge disparities across the city, this is one thing that we can do to, it won't make a huge difference, but it will make some difference. And if we can make as much difference as we can across every aspect of the levers that are available to us, then it will all add up to something. So I would please ask for you to support this. People in those suburbs, as much more than other suburbs across the city, are suffering from cost of living pressures at the moment, and any help that we can give, I think, will be appreciated. So please, I'd appreciate your support.
Councillor Hancock.
Yeah, thanks, Mr Mayor. Look, I just want to reiterate what Councillor Johnston has said in her introductory comments, really. I just urge councillors to support this because it actually does move a larger group of people out of the extreme increases that some people are experiencing, and in particular people who live in our lower income areas of the city. So it really is just a matter of ensuring that we have a conscience and exercise some discretion in terms of applying equity across the city. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Councillor Naylor.
Thank you. I have swung back and forth a few times in my thinking around this one, and certainly the presentation that was that officers provided this morning was helpful for me in getting a real understanding about who the winners are and who the losers will be if we change the UAGC further. I won't be supporting this. My reasons are that pivot point that was talked about of people who have over 3,800 rates. If we decrease the UAGC, those people will pay more. And the example that Steve gave us of many of those properties on page 132 very well demonstrates that. And some of those properties are in Ashurst, they're in lower, they're in areas where the house is not worth much, but the land value has gone up heaps. And those are some of the people that we've heard from through the submission process who simply are saying they cannot afford that level of increase. My second reason for not supporting it is that looking at that same graph to the non-residential, yes, while that light blue bar does improve the overall picture for residential, it does have quite a negative effect in non-residential. That light blue bar that's right at the far right hand, which is not in our papers but is on the presentation, that light blue bar that's presuming that our rates increase is 6%, not 8.3. So I hate to think how high that would be if based on the modelling of 8.3, which is where we are at the moment. So at this point in the day, the impact on the non-residential of decreasing the UAGC, I think, is quite negative. It actually increases significantly that those non-residential ratepayers who are paying more than $1,000 more on their rates. So that's another, perhaps 100 of them that wouldn't have been, who have been pushed up into that bracket. It's a tricky one because definitely there is some gain for residential, but that gain for residential is only the sort of gain that we can achieve by reducing that percentage a little bit more. So for the harm it does, or for the negative impact on the non-residential sector, I won't be supporting it.
Councillor Dingwall.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I will be supporting this one. As officers and Councillor Johnson has already pointed out, if we did this, this would have a positive impact on 3/4 of the residential people. That's when you're looking at people whose land value is under, I think it was 750K, there's a huge amount of people in the city that fit that bracket. That is my entire street, at the very least, who are currently facing a 24% increase. Every single house on my street in Takaro is facing a 24% increase. And when you look at the kind of people who live on my street, they are people who are actually struggling to pay that $700 increase. And so $700 is a huge amount for low-income families. And this, changing the UAGC down to 200 would actually have, it feels like a small impact, but actually to each of those individual houses, it's a huge impact. So I do think that we need to pull all of our levers, even if it's little changes, that would make a difference. So I am going to support this one.
All right. Look, I'm just, before I go back to you, Councillor Johnson, for any right of reply. Look, I'm supportive of this based on the advice and information from officers. I mean, it has been outlined that there are, I suppose, gains and negatives, but I think the gains outweigh the negatives. You know, I think some of the comments are right in that it is another small way of supporting those that are getting the greatest or the largest increases. So it is a little bit of a 50-50 call, but I am supportive of, again, just another little way of helping those that are getting the biggest shock. So I'd urge you to support it as well. So back to you, Councillor Johnson, for any right of reply.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Yes, and thanks, colleagues, for your comments. There were a couple of comments that I did just want to respond to. One is around the impact on the non-residential sector of doing this. Yes, I acknowledge it does have an impact on the non-residential sector. But when you look at the graph of the rates increase on the non-residential sector, there's a significant proportion at the moment that are getting a substantial decrease. And I did put the question to Amanda Lindsley from Chamber of Commerce about whether or not she thought it was reasonable that the commercial sector got decreases. And if I remember correctly, she did say that she thought that no one should really be getting a decrease in their rates. So the Mayor's made the point before that this is about sharing the burden. There's no perfect solution here, councillors. We can't really do what we'd like to do, which is to share the burden more evenly. But this is one of the tools that's available to us to do that. So I would ask for your support on it. In terms of whether or not we should do this or decrease the general rates increase, I don't think it's an either or. For me, it's an and. We should be using absolutely every tool at our disposal. You know, every lever, every opportunity to reduce the burden on rates for the residents of the city. So to me, it's not about should we do this or should we reduce rates? It's about doing both. So I would urge you to support this. I think it's one of the things that we can do to assist the residential sector. Thanks.
Okay, councillors, we will look to vote, please. And that is passed, 14 votes for and 1 against. Okay, just the final one before we break for a lunch break, councillors and others here in the chamber and online. And this is around council writing to the Valuer General, and I'll just get his name. I think it's Mr. Sullivan, Neil Sullivan, and expressing frustration and concern from council, the governance side of the organisation, because I know that the officers are probably differing in our opinion over the process used in the recent revaluation of Palmerston North City. So I'm moving that. The Deputy Mayor has seconded it. Yeah, Council. I'm going to just withdraw the Chief Executive's name just to make sure it's around council rights. Yeah. So can the Deputy Mayor's had to duck out. Can I have a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Harpiter. There's a few of you putting your hand up. That's a good sign. So look, this is again another way of expressing frustration, concern. 99% of submitters were in this space. So I think we do have to show that the system, I believe, is unsustainable if we just keep this constant revaluation, constant total burden on the ratepayer, and there's got to be other ways of funding local government if we want to survive. Councillor Bowen, online.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for bringing this one forward, because I know it's something that we've all had many conversations about, and I think you frame it well in that bigger piece of work, which is about the future of local government. I link this back to the comments I made earlier about our engagement, in that the levers that local government has to work with aren't well understood by our community. Our rating system and the legal framework of that is not well understood by our community, and I'm sure that our community is no different to all the other communities of New Zealand in that regard. I understand that our revaluation process did go through the full submission and review by the top level of this, and perhaps there's nothing to be gained by writing, but there's certainly everything to be gained by raising our concerns and having that feed into, hopefully, that future of local government work, to say that this puts immense pressure on local communities and people don't understand how it works. So thank you for raising it, and I'll certainly be supporting it.
Councillor Naylor.
Yeah, so I won't be supporting this recommendation. The reason being is that I think it's sort of passing the buck in a way that isn't necessarily appropriate. I think, yes, we are frustrated in the way that the revaluations affect our rates, but that is not actually the Valuer General's responsibility. They carry out their role and apply their professional lens to the work that they do. I think we need to really acknowledge the reasons for the revaluations being distributed in the way that they are, and that really is about our own finance policy. And we've teased out that, and it's clear that we can't change that for probably a year or possibly 2 years. This is not the first time that this council has been faced with significant changes to rates and a redistribution of rates because of revaluations. 6 years when I stood for council and was knocking on many doors, there were people in the community at that time who had a rates increase of around, rates increases in the 20s, and they were very unhappy about that. That was because of the revaluation at that time. The revaluation this time has been significant and is more significant than it was 6 years ago, but it's not the first time that we've been aware that change of valuations does cause a significant redistribution in the way that we apply the rates. I think that we need to look at the tools that we can use. Yes, we're restricted by legislation, and that's very challenging for us, but I don't think it's reasonable for us to put the blame or express those frustrations to the Valuer General for the whole, perhaps in the way that this recommendation describes. So I won't support it.
Councillor Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I actually have a level of sympathy for what Councillor Naylor has just expressed, but I am absolutely committed to this council writing to the Valuer General and expressing their concerns. You can't really tell if we're passing the buck or not because everything's so hidden behind the, iron curtain basically of QV, and you can't get in there. You can't see the data, you can't see the algorithm, and it's all hidden behind behind a closed door. And that needs to be the fundamental message that comes through here. Valuation of properties has been just this quiet backwater that's actually needs some light shown on it. The algorithms need to be out in public, the data needs to be out in public, because it serves the public to do it.
Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I too am not going to support this. There is a process around this, and we do have the tools to change. We could have changed things earlier in December if we chose to. The valuations are what they are. I think the issue that we've got, it's the fact that councils cannot afford to do what they need to do with the money that they're getting from the rates. The ratepayers no longer can, the cost of construction and everything's gone up. I mean, we just haven't got the money for infrastructure anymore. So it's not about the actual revaluations. The 8.3%, we voted for that as a council. It was around the distribution of it. And that was around the revaluations. And as I said to you before, it's just the balance of it, and we had the tools. At the end of the day, it's to go back to the Attorney General, whatever you call him, it's around the fact that councils no longer can, the ratepayers can't afford what the councils need to do. We need a lot more money to be able to, look at our wastewater, 500k. And if Three Waters doesn't go through, what's council? And I don't support Three Waters, but I'm just saying that if it did go through, 500k, we would have to find for infrastructure for wastewater. There's a huge amount of stuff. So I think you're just wasting your time writing a letter. I think it just makes us look stupid that we don't understand our own processes. So I'm not supporting it.
Councillor Dingwell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am going to support writing a letter to the Valuer General, mainly because I do think that it's important that we know exactly how they do each of these valuations. I remember when they came in and spoke to us last year, I specifically asked them about my own property in this chamber. And I talked about how I had purchased a property off my parents, buying it for the same price that they had purchased it for a couple of years earlier. And I remember them saying that even though my property hadn't gone up in terms of sale price, they just crossed that off the list and I guess dismissed it. So it's not really clear to me how land value could possibly go down. Like it's hard to know what you could possibly do in a street when you don't want your land value to go up, how that whole thing works. So I think having more clarity around exactly what it is that QV does to come to these conclusions and what they could do to reduce it would be helpful. And I'm also, I guess, want to acknowledge the fact that the Valuer General did say no to Auckland when they went through their rates process. So it is possible to change things. The question is, where do we fit, and what part of the process do we need to come in to say, hey, have a second look at that, please? Yeah, so I think having more information on that so that we're more informed on at what point we need to say, you're stuffed up here, can you do it again, would be really helpful.
Okay, look, just as a right of reply, there's no more in the queue. Look, this should be a public process, and it absolutely isn't. I mean, if you think it is, then just vote against it, you know. And if you don't want to change the system, vote against it. But absolutely, if you want to try, you've got to vote for it. We've got to try. I mean, if you honestly think this is a great way of rating our residents, I question it, I really do. Councillor Barrett said, where's the open data? Where's the algorithms? I had no idea that officers had gone and said this is a great thing. Where do we fit in? As Councillor Dingwall said, where do we fit into the system? Because we're going to get judged. Absolutely we're going to get judged. And in some ways, the process is broken and it will continue to be broken. You wait till Wellington or Christchurch and others have revaluations. The pennies will start to drop then. So we do need to do something. The system of rating in New Zealand is unsustainable, and we do need to challenge the Valuer General on what they're doing. Hopefully, Mr. Neil Sullivan will take note. He obviously did in Auckland, and he may do for us. It's too late probably for us in this current round, but it may have an impact down the line. If we do nothing, we're just accepting and just give up. So please vote for this. We will vote, please. And that is passed 13 votes for, 2 against and 1 abstention. Thank you. Right, we'll now move to lunch. Just thinking what we've got next. We're going to do lunch. So we'll be back in the chamber at quarter to 2, please, for those online and in the gallery. Thank you.